Hello everyone. This month has been really hard for the channel, and I truly need your support more than ever. It feels like my videos aren't reaching you anymore, and notifications aren't working as before. Please like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. If we reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments, it will really help me continue. The Pisgah dispatch came through the radio at 5:47 a.m. on the morning of October 14th. I logged the time in my notebook before reaching for the handset. 11 years in this district, and I have never stopped writing things down. My name is Eli Cantrell. I am 37 years old. I have been a backcountry ranger with the U.S. Forest Service since I finished my forestry degree at Western Carolina in 2014. Before that, I worked seasonal fire crews in the Nantahala. My father worked timber in Madison County for 30 years, and his father did the same. I tell you this not because it matters to the report, but because it matters to me that whoever reads this understands I am not someone who startles easily in the woods. The mountains are the only place I have ever felt at home, and I know how they behave. The assignment that morning was routine. A line of slow-moving storms had crossed the Blue Ridge the week before, dropping about 4 inches of rain and toppling timber along several trail corridors in the Shining Rock Wilderness. I was scheduled for a 4-day solo patrol to assess damage along the Big East Fork Trail, up across the ridge past Old Butt Knob, and down to the small backcountry cabin at the head of Greasy Cove. Sign blowdown, washed bridges, eroded switchbacks, standard storm aftermath survey work. I have done 100 of them. I drove out from the district office at 6:30 a.m. and parked at the Big East Fork trailhead by 7:12. The fog was sitting low in the gap that morning, the kind of dense white fog that thickens overnight in October when the cold air pools in the hollows. I logged the parking lot conditions, the temperature 46 degrees and the time. I checked my pack one last time. Topographic map, GPS unit, radio, spare batteries, 4 days of food sealed in a bear canister, water filter, first aid, notebook, pencil, 2 pencils actually. I always carry 2. I started up the trail at 7:24 a.m. The first 2 miles followed the east fork of the Pigeon River, climbing gently through stands of yellow birch and tulip poplar. The leaves were past peak. Most had come down in the storm. The ground was wet and matted with brown and yellow, and the deeper red of the few oaks. I noted 3 blowdowns in the first mile, none of them blocking the trail seriously. I tagged each one with a yellow ribbon and logged the location and approximate diameter. A sycamore at 0.4 miles, 12 inches across the trunk. A red maple at 0.9 miles, 8 inches. A larger yellow birch at 1.7 miles, 18 inches, which I marked for the chainsaw crew. The trail was passable, but would need work before winter. The first thing I noticed that was not quite right happened at 9:18 a.m. I had stopped to drink water at a place where the trail turns east and crosses a small unnamed feeder creek. The creek was running well, maybe 4 or 5 inches deep across the crossing. I sat on a wet log and pulled out my water bottle and listened. I should have heard the creek. I could see the creek. I could see water moving over the stones, the small white riffles in the shallows, the way the surface broke around a fallen branch. But the sound I heard was a steady creek sound coming from somewhere uphill to my left, maybe 40 or 50 yards into the woods, where there is no water on any map I have ever seen. I sat for a while and listened. The sound did not move. It did not vary. It sounded exactly like a creek. The same volume and the same texture coming from a slope that I knew from 20 patrols was dry shale and rhododendron all the way up to the ridge. After about 3 minutes, I stood up and walked a short distance uphill to investigate. The sound continued at the same volume. I climbed about 20 yards into the laurel, and the sound seemed to be a constant distance ahead of me, neither closer nor farther. I stopped. I listened. The creek I had been sitting beside was still audible behind me, normal and clear, and the other creek sound was still ahead of me somewhere I could not see. I told myself it was an acoustic trick of the slope. The Appalachians do strange things with sound. Fog has a way of carrying water noise from one drainage into another. I have heard creeks from a half-mile away on still mornings. The terrain folds and the air pockets, and you can sit in one valley and hear another. It is unusual, but it happens. I logged it in my notebook without elaboration. 9:18 a.m. Audio anomaly. Creek sound uphill, no creek on map. Acoustic carry from main drainage. Continuing patrol. I kept moving. By 11 o'clock, the fog had started to lift in patches and the temperature had climbed into the low 50s. I could see down into the East Fork Valley from the small overlook at 2.6 miles. The valley was still soft with leftover fog, gray-white in the bottoms, the ridgelines emerging above it. It was beautiful. It is always beautiful in October, even when something is wrong. I reached the junction with the Greasy Cove Trail at 12:14 p.m. and stopped to eat. I had packed 2 ham sandwiches and an apple, and I ate slowly, sitting on a flat sandstone outcrop where the trail turns north. The sun was warming my back. I made a note of the junction sign, which was loose and would need to be reset in the spring, and I drank from my water bottle and watched a few late warblers move through the brush below. It was while I was sitting there that I noticed the absence of sound for the first time. I am a quiet eater. I had been sitting still for maybe 10 minutes. The fog had largely cleared and the wind was minimal, just a faint stir in the upper canopy. I should have been hearing the things you always hear in an Appalachian forest in mid-October: squirrels, chickadees, crows somewhere along the ridge, the dry rattle of a downy woodpecker, the distant scratching of leaves under deer. I should have been hearing all of that. I was hearing nothing. I sat with my sandwich half eaten, and I listened, very carefully, the way I have trained myself to listen. The wind. That was there. A few oak leaves moving against each other on the bare branches above me. That was there. But no birds. No squirrels. No insects. Nothing alive. This continued for, by my watch, 14 minutes. I timed it deliberately, once I noticed it. From 12:24 p.m. to 12:38 p.m., the woods around the Greasy Cove Trail junction contained no animal sound of any kind. At 12:38, a single crow called from somewhere down in the valley, and within 30 seconds the normal layered noise of the forest resumed as if nothing had happened. I wrote it down. 12:24 p.m. to 12:38 p.m., complete avian and small mammal silence in vicinity of junction, wind present, no visible disturbance, no predator sign observed. Continuing patrol. I told myself, again, that there were explanations. A hawk overhead, maybe. Sometimes when a raptor is moving through, the songbirds go quiet for several minutes. I had not seen a hawk, but that did not mean one was not there. The canopy was still thick enough in places to hide a passing bird. It was a reasonable explanation. I held onto it. I shouldered my pack at 12:51 p.m. and started up the Greasy Cove Trail toward the cabin. The fog began to thicken again on the higher slopes by mid-afternoon. By 4:30 p.m. I was in dense laurel thickets on the approach to the cove, and visibility was down to maybe 30 feet. The trail through the rhododendron tunnels is narrow and dark even in clear weather. In fog it becomes a kind of green-gray corridor where the world ends at the next bend. I had walked it many times before. I was not lost. I knew where I was. But there is a particular feeling in those tunnels that I have never gotten used to. A feeling of being inside something, rather than passing through it. I reached the Greasy Cove cabin at 5:42 p.m. The cabin at the head of Greasy Cove is a small log structure built by the CCC in 1937 and rebuilt twice since. It sits on a flat shelf about a quarter-mile below the ridge, with a small spring uphill and a fire ring out front. There is no electricity. There is no plumbing. There is a wood stove, 4 bunks, a small table, and a metal box bolted to the floor where the logbook is kept along with emergency supplies. The cabin is used by trail crews, biologists, and the occasional thru-hiker with permission. Most nights of the year it sits empty. I unlocked the door at 5:48 p.m. and propped it open. The interior smelled the way it always smells in the fall, like old wood and damp wool and the faint sweetness of stovepipe creosote. I set my pack on the table and went to start a fire before doing anything else, because the cabin holds the cold, and once the sun is gone the temperature in there drops quickly. While the fire was catching, I pulled out the logbook. The logbook is a simple bound notebook, water-stained at the edges, where everyone who uses the cabin records their visit. Name, date, time of arrival, time of departure, conditions, any incidents. The book goes back to 2019. The previous one is in the district office, archived. I have written in this book maybe 24 times. I always check the most recent entries when I arrive, both as a matter of protocol and out of curiosity. You see who has been through. The last entry before mine was dated September 28th. A trail crew of 3 names I recognized, in for a 2-night maintenance trip on the upper Shining Rock section. They had logged their arrival and departure normally. Below their entry, in handwriting I did not recognize, there was a single line that I read 3 times before I accepted that I was reading it correctly. Heard the creek that isn't there. Don't go up. There was no name, no date, no time. The handwriting was small and slanted, in pencil, and it had been written carefully. Not scrawled, not panicked, just placed there, between the previous entry and the empty page where I would write mine. I sat for a long time with the book in my lap. The fire was making good progress in the stove now, and I could hear it pop and settle. Outside, the fog had thickened to the point that I could not see the far edge of the small clearing in front of the cabin. I tried to convince myself that this was a joke. Backcountry ranger humor is not always polite. The trail crew that had been here in September might have left it as a prank, or someone else, an unauthorized visitor, might have entered the cabin and written it. The lock on the cabin is not particularly serious. A determined person could get in, but I had heard the creek that isn't there, less than 9 hours ago, on a slope where there is no water. And whoever had written this line had heard it too, or had wanted me to think they had heard it. I wrote my own entry below theirs without commenting on the line. E. Cantrell, USFS. Arrived 5:42 p.m., October 14. Storm Survey Patrol, 4 days. Conditions: fog, 49 degrees, wind calm, no incidents. I put the book back in the metal box and closed the lid. I ate dinner at 7 p.m., a foil pouch of rehydrated beef stew, sitting at the table with my radio on low. I tried to raise dispatch for an evening check-in, but I got only static. This was not unusual. The Greasy Cove cabin sits in a topographic shadow that blocks the repeater for most of the evening. I would try again from the ridge in the morning. I logged the failed check-in and set the radio aside. At 8:14 p.m. I heard the first set of footsteps. I was inside the cabin, near the stove, putting another log in. The footsteps were outside, somewhere to the northwest of the cabin, on the slope above the spring. They were heavy, boot on leaves heavy, a deliberate cadence, the kind of pace a person uses on a moderate incline. Not fast, not slow, walking. I stood very still and listened. The footsteps continued for about 20 seconds, walking from west to east along the slope above the cabin, and then they stopped. I went to the door and opened it. The fog was thick enough that the light from inside the cabin barely reached the edge of the clearing. The footsteps did not resume. I called out, "Hello?" The fog absorbed my voice almost immediately. There was no answer. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, listening, my flashlight in my hand but not turned on. I knew that turning on the light would make me a silhouette in the doorway and would do nothing to penetrate the fog. I listened instead. The forest was, I noticed, very quiet again, not silent the way it had been at the junction earlier in the day, but quiet. No animals, only the wind. After about 10 minutes I closed the door and bolted it. I told myself it had been a bear. Black bears walk through the cove regularly, and although their gait does not usually sound like boot on leaves, the cadence had been similar enough that I could make myself accept the explanation. Bears do not knock or call out. They walk and then they stop and then they walk again. The footsteps I had heard had fit that pattern. Roughly, I logged the incident. 8:14 p.m., footsteps audible on slope above cabin, west to east, approximately 20 seconds duration. No visual contact due to fog. Probable bear, no follow-up. I went to sleep around 9:30 p.m. in the lower bunk against the east wall, with the stove still warm and my pack within reach. I woke up at 11:52 p.m. sharply, the way you wake when something has changed but you are not sure what. The cabin was dark. The stove was down to coals. I lay still and listened. The footsteps were back. Closer this time, not on the slope above the cabin, just outside the wall, no more than 10 feet from where I was lying, walking. The same cadence, west to east, around the cabin. They circled the cabin twice, at the same speed, in the same direction. Then they stopped. I did not move. I did not turn on a light. I lay in the dark with my hand on the flashlight and I listened until I could not hear anything anymore, and then I listened for another hour after that, and at some point I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew it was morning and the fog was lifting and there was light coming through the small window above the table. I wrote a single line in my notebook before I made coffee. 11:52 p.m. Footsteps circled cabin twice. No further activity, no visible sign. I did not write what I had been thinking, which was that the footsteps had been the same cadence as the ones at 8:14, but slower, as if the person or whatever it was had grown tired between the two passes. And I did not write that I was not sure a bear could circle a cabin twice in exactly the same direction with exactly the same spacing between each footfall. The fog burned off by 8:15 a.m. and I went outside to check for sign. The ground around the cabin is mixed. Patches of bare wet earth, patches of moss, patches of leaf litter, some flat stones near the doorstep. I walked the perimeter slowly, looking down, in the way you learn to look when you have been tracking deer and bear and people for as long as I have. I went around the cabin 3 times. I checked the slope above the spring. I checked the clearing in front. I checked the area near the woodpile where someone walking around the cabin would have had to pass. There were no tracks. I am not saying there were no tracks that I recognized. I am saying there were no tracks at all. No boot prints, no bear prints, no deer prints, no raccoon, nothing. The ground around the cabin was as undisturbed as it would have been if no one had been near it since the last rain, including me. My own tracks from the previous evening, where I had walked from the trail to the door and then back out to the woodpile to check it for the night, were faint to the point of being almost invisible. The damp leaf litter had settled, but 2 sets of footsteps that had moved around the cabin within 15 feet of where I was sleeping had left nothing. I stood by the woodpile for a long time, looking at the ground. There is a logical explanation for everything. I have always believed this and I still believe it. Wind can disturb leaves and erase faint tracks. A heavy dew can settle the litter overnight. Animals leave less sign on soaked leaves than on dry ones. It is possible that a bear walking on saturated leaf cover after a fog night would leave essentially no trace. It is possible. I have seen tracks that were difficult to follow even on good substrate. It is possible. I logged my findings. 8:32 a.m. Perimeter check. No tracks observed. Substrate: wet leaf litter, scattered moss, exposed root mats, sign degradation likely. Continuing patrol. I made coffee and ate 2 granola bars and packed up. The plan for the second day was to climb from the cabin to the ridge along the Shining Rock Spur, traverse east along the ridge atop to the rock outcrop, and then descend the other side of the ridge along the old Butt Knob Trail to a small saddle where I would camp for the night. About 6 miles of moving, most of it slow because of the storm damage I would need to assess. I started up the spur at 9:05 a.m. The first mile was uneventful. The trail climbs through a beech forest, then through a transitional band of red spruce and yellow birch, and finally into the open balds near the top. I logged 2 blowdowns and 1 section of trail tread that had washed out badly enough to require rerouting. I marked it on the map. I drank water at the spring near the 4,800-foot contour. I checked my radio. Static. At 11:23 a.m. I reached the ridge. The Shining Rock Ridge in October in fair weather is one of the great views in the southern Appalachians. From the rocks you can see across the Pigeon River drainage to Cold Mountain and beyond it, on a clear day all the way to the Smokies. That morning the air was still hazy from the fog burning off, and the distant ridges were faded to a pale blue-gray, the kind of layered Appalachian distance that gives the mountains their name. I sat on the rocks for 15 minutes and ate an apple, and drank water and made notes about the trail conditions. I tried the radio again. I got partial contact with the district office, enough to confirm my position and my plan for the day. Dispatch acknowledged me. I logged the time. 11:48 a.m. Radio check successful. Partial signal. Shining Rock Summit. Position confirmed. Continuing east along ridge. I started east at 12:02 p.m. The ridge trail is narrow and exposed and runs along the spine of the mountain for about 1.5 miles before dropping down toward Old Butt Knob. The wind was steady from the west, maybe 10 miles an hour, and the temperature on the ridge was cool, around 50. I walked carefully. The footing was good, but the rocks were still damp from the morning fog, and a slip on the ridge can have serious consequences. About half a mile in, I stopped to look at a particularly bad blowdown, a large red spruce that had fallen across the trail and would need cutting. I knelt down to measure the trunk diameter with my handspan. Behind me, somewhere down the slope to the south, I heard a voice. I did not catch the words. The voice was at the edge of audibility, carried on the wind, the way voices sometimes carry up from a valley in the early afternoon. A single male voice, calm, saying something I could not make out. Then silence. I stood up and turned and looked down the slope. There is no trail on that side of the ridge below Shining Rock. The slope is steep and choked with rhododendron and down timber from a wildfire in 2016. A person could be down there. It would be unusual. It would be difficult. But it is possible. I waited. The voice did not repeat. I called out once. Hello? The wind took my voice. I waited 5 more minutes. Then I logged the incident and moved on. 12:31 p.m. Single male voice audible from south slope below Shining Rock Ridge. Approximately 100 yards distant by estimate. Words unclear. No visual contact. No response to call. Possible day hiker off trail or sound carry from valley. Continuing patrol. At 12:47 p.m. I heard the same voice again. This time it was ahead of me. On the ridge. Somewhere in the rocks. Same calm tone. Same male timbre. I could not make out the words. The voice spoke for what I estimated was 4 or 5 seconds, and then it stopped. I stood still on the trail. The thing that bothered me about it, the thing I noticed even as I was making myself believe that I had simply heard another hiker, was that the voice had sounded exactly the same as the one I had heard 15 minutes earlier. Not similar, the same cadence, the same volume, the same length, the same pitch. I have heard a lot of voices in the woods over the years. I know how voices change when they move. I know how distance and wind and terrain affect them. A voice carried from 100 yards down a steep south slope does not sound the same as a voice spoken from the rocks ahead of you on the ridge. The acoustics are different. The intervening air is different. The relationship to the wind is different. These two voices had sounded identical. I did not write that in the log. I wrote only that I had heard a second voice. 12:47 p.m. Voice audible from ridge ahead. Similar characteristics to 12:31 incident. No visual contact. Continuing patrol with elevated awareness. I kept walking east. I reached the small saddle below Old Butt Knob at 3:18 p.m. and set up camp in the designated tent site at the edge of the clearing. The saddle is wooded but not densely so. Mostly red spruce with some yellow birch. And the camping area is on a flat patch of duff that has been used by hikers for decades. There is no water source at the saddle itself. I had brought enough in my pack to get me through the night, with a small reserve. I pitched my tent. I hung my bear canister in a yellow birch about 100 feet downslope. I set up my small stove on a flat rock and started water for a freeze-dried meal. The sun was getting low. The light on the upper trunks of the spruce was that thick gold color you get in late afternoon in the high mountains, where everything seems sharper than it is. I ate at 5:30 p.m. I logged the day. 5:42 p.m. Camped at Old Butt Knob Saddle. Distance covered, approximately 6.2 miles. 3 blowdowns noted. 2 sections needing tread repair. Audio anomalies. 2 voice incidents on ridge between 12:31 and 12:47 p.m. No further developments. We'll check radio at sunset. I tried the radio at 6:15 p.m. I got nothing but static. The static was odd. Ordinarily, when I am out of repeater range, I get clean static, the simple wash of background noise that the radio produces when it has no signal to lock onto. The static I was getting that evening had a pattern in it. I cannot describe it any other way. It was not speech. It was not music. It was not a tone. But there was a rhythm in it, a faint pulse, like the static was being modulated by something I could not quite hear. I switched channels. The pattern was on every channel. I switched to the weather frequency. The pattern was there too. The NOAA broadcast did not come through. Only the pattern static. I turned the radio off and on. The pattern was still there. I turned the radio off and sat with it for a while. Then I tried again. The pattern was still there. I logged it. 6:24 p.m. Radio interference, all channels. Pattern static, possible local source. Unable to raise dispatch. Will retry at 8 p.m. and at sunrise. I tried again at 8 p.m. The pattern was gone. Clean static on all channels. Still no signal, but no pattern. I tried the weather frequency. NOAA came through clear, broadcasting the regional forecast for the next 24 hours. Patchy fog overnight, clearing by mid-morning, with high temperatures in the upper 50s and a slight chance of afternoon showers. I logged the forecast. I told myself that the pattern earlier had been atmospheric, some interference from a thunderstorm in another state, or from a power line many miles away, or from one of the dozens of things that can cause weird interference on a backcountry radio. There are explanations. There are always explanations. I crawled into my tent at 9 p.m. I lay awake for a long time. The wind had died completely. The forest around the saddle was absolutely still. I could hear my own breathing inside the tent, the small sounds of my sleeping bag shifting when I moved. I could not hear anything else. This continued for several hours. At 11:14 p.m., by my watch, I heard a single footstep on the duff about 20 feet from my tent. One footstep. Then silence. I did not move. I lay on my back with my eyes open in the dark and I listened. The silence continued. After perhaps 2 minutes, there was another footstep, this one closer. Then silence again. The pattern continued for I think about 30 minutes, although it is difficult to be certain because I was not looking at my watch. A single footstep, then a long silence, then another single footstep, slowly working closer to my tent and then slowly moving away again. Whatever it was did not pause near the tent. It did not breathe heavily. It did not snuffle. It did not exhibit any of the behaviors that a black bear would exhibit if it had come to investigate a campsite. It walked. 1 step, pause, 1 step, pause. The intervals between steps were not consistent. Some were short, maybe 10 seconds. Some were long, maybe 40 seconds. There was no rhythm that I could identify. At some point the footsteps stopped and did not resume. I did not sleep until perhaps 3 a.m., when exhaustion overcame me. I dreamed nothing that I can remember. When I woke at 6:42 a.m., the forest was full of the normal early morning sounds, and the saddle looked exactly as it had the night before. The duff undisturbed, the trees still, the air cold and damp with overnight condensation. I went outside the tent and walked the area. There were no tracks. The duff is soft enough that a person would leave faint depressions, even if they would not leave clear prints. There were no depressions. I made coffee and ate a granola bar and tried not to think about it. I had 2 more days of patrol. I had work to do. I broke camp at 7:30 a.m. and started down the old Butt Knob Trail toward the Greasy Cove headwaters, where I planned to follow a side trail east to inspect a stream crossing that had been reported damaged. The descent was steep and rocky, and I focused on my footing. I logged blowdowns. I checked the trail tread. I tried the radio twice and got clean static both times, no pattern. At 9:47 a.m. I came to a section of trail that did not match my memory. I have walked this trail at least 8 times in the last 6 years. It descends a moderately steep slope through a tunnel of rhododendron, then opens into a small flat area before crossing a small unnamed branch and beginning a more gradual descent. The flat area is distinctive. There is a particular yellow birch at the eastern edge of it with a forked trunk that I have always used as a mental landmark. I have a photograph of the tree in a folder on my computer at the district office, taken in 2022 during a trail inventory project. I came around a bend in the rhododendron tunnel at 9:47 a.m. and the flat area was not there. The trail continued descending more steeply than I remembered, through more rhododendron, with no flat section anywhere ahead of me. I stopped. I looked at my GPS. The GPS placed me exactly where I should have been, about a half mile below the saddle, on the section of trail where the flat area is. The trail did not match. I considered the possibility that the storm had altered the area. A landslide could have changed the topography. Heavy erosion could have steepened the slope. These things happen, but the slide or erosion that would be required to eliminate a flat shelf of ground 20 feet across would be enormous. There would be obvious evidence. There would be raw earth, exposed roots, debris piles. The slope around me looked completely undisturbed. I kept walking. The trail continued to descend. The flat area never appeared. About 15 minutes later, I crossed a small branch, which I assumed was the unnamed creek the trail crosses below the flat area, and I continued the descent. The terrain on this side of the crossing was vaguely familiar. The trail eventually leveled off into the section I remembered. The descent was complete, but the flat area and the forked yellow birch were missing. I logged it carefully. 10:14 a.m. Trail morphology discrepancy noted on Old Butt Knob descent. Expected flat shelf at approximately 4,200 feet elevation absent. Possible erosion or landslip but no obvious surface evidence. Will revisit on return. I tried to keep walking and to keep thinking about my work. The light was good. The leaves were beautiful. I logged a fallen poplar. I marked a section where the water bars needed clearing. I tried not to think about the tree. The stream crossing I had been sent to inspect was at the bottom of the descent, where the unnamed branch from the saddle meets a larger creek that eventually flows into Sunburst. The crossing is a footbridge, a simple structure of 2 parallel logs with a planked surface, built in 2018 by a trail crew. The bridge had reportedly suffered damage in the storms. I reached the crossing at 11:08 a.m. The bridge was intact. I stood on the bank for a long moment. Looking at it, the reported damage had been described in the incident report as significant. The eastern log displaced from its abutment, the decking partially torn loose. I had brought materials in my pack for a temporary repair. The bridge in front of me showed none of this damage. The decking was tight. The logs were seated. The abutments looked fine. There was the normal weathering you would expect of a 6-year-old bridge in the Appalachian climate, but nothing that suggested storm damage. I walked across the bridge. It was solid underfoot. I inspected each connection. I looked at the underside from the downstream bank. I could find nothing wrong with it. I sat down on the upstream bank and ate a granola bar and thought. The incident report had been filed by a trail crew foreman I trusted, a man named Roy Bradley. who had been working in the district for 22 years. Roy did not file false reports. Roy did not exaggerate damage. If Roy said a bridge needed work, the bridge needed work. The report had described the damage in detail. The bridge in front of me did not need work. I considered the possibility that I had come to the wrong bridge. There are several stream crossings in the area. The GPS coordinates on the report matched my position. The trail signage matched. The bridge matched the construction described in the report. It was the right bridge. I considered the possibility that someone had repaired the bridge after the report was filed. This would have been unusual. Trail crews in this district do not generally perform unscheduled repairs, especially on remote bridges. The materials I had brought were not specialized. Any competent crew could have done the work, but there would have been a record. There would have been a follow-up report. There had been none. I considered the possibility that the bridge had not been damaged at all, and that Roy had been mistaken or had reported the wrong bridge, or had been confused. This was the most rational explanation. Even careful, experienced people sometimes make mistakes. I would talk to Roy when I got back to the office. I logged the finding. 11:31 a.m. Stream crossing inspected. No damage observed. Bridge intact and serviceable. Recommend follow-up with reporting officer to confirm location and incident details. I ate the rest of my lunch and started back up toward the saddle. The plan for the afternoon was to retrace my route over the ridge, descend to the Greasy Cove cabin again, and spend a second night there before continuing on the second leg of the patrol the following day. I did not love the idea of another night at the cabin, but I did love the idea of having a roof and a wood stove, and I was tired enough that I did not want to camp again in the open. The climb back up was hard. The old Butt-Knob descent is steeper coming up than it feels going down, and my legs were already feeling the previous day's work. I moved slowly. I took breaks. At 12:55 p.m. I reached the section where the flat area should have been. The flat area was there. I stood at the eastern edge of it, on the trail, and looked. The yellow birch with the forked trunk was there. The flat duff was there. The whole feature was there, exactly as I remembered it from previous patrols. Exactly as it should have been on the descent. I walked into the flat area and stood by the tree. I put my hand on the bark. I looked up at the fork. I took out my GPS. The GPS placed me at the position I expected. I looked back down the trail. The rhododendron tunnel I had just come up through looked the same as the one I remembered descending earlier in the morning. The terrain around me looked, in all respects, normal. I tried to find a way to explain what had happened. I worked through possibilities. I had taken a different trail down without realizing it. There was no different trail. I had been mistaken in the morning, perhaps disoriented by fatigue or by the wrongness of the previous night. I had not been disoriented. I had been clear. I had checked my GPS. The trail had been different. I sat down at the base of the yellow birch for a while and tried to breathe slowly and not think about anything in particular. This was, by my count, the 7th anomaly I had observed in less than 2 days. The creek that was not there, the 14 minutes of silence at the junction, the footsteps around the cabin without tracks, the voices on the ridge that sounded identical, the patterned radio static, the single footsteps near my tent, the missing flat area, and now the flat area was back, exactly where it should have been. I thought about turning back. I thought about hiking out to the trailhead by the most direct route, getting in my truck, driving to the district office, and writing all of it up. The patrol could be cut short, the remaining damage assessment could be reassigned. I had enough material now to justify an early return on professional grounds. The patterned radio interference alone would be reportable as a communications issue. I did not turn back. I am not going to pretend that I made this decision for purely rational reasons. I made it because part of me did not yet believe what I was experiencing, and because part of me did not want to admit that I was disturbed, and because part of me, the most experienced and most stubborn part, refused to leave a patrol unfinished. I had 2 more days. I had a job to do. I had a roof to sleep under. I stood up and continued up the trail. I reached the ridge at 2:22 p.m. The voices did not return. The radio gave me clean static. The ridge looked exactly as it had the day before. I crossed it carefully, moving fast where I could, and started the descent down the shining rock spur toward the cabin. I reached the cabin at 4:47 p.m. The door was open. I had locked the door when I left in the morning. I remembered locking it. I had even checked the lock twice, because the cabin doors in this district have an old mechanism that occasionally fails to catch. I had heard the bolt slide home. I had pulled on the handle. The door had been locked. The door was now standing open, about 10 inches. swinging slowly in a breeze that I could not feel. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and watched the cabin for a long moment. Nothing moved inside. Nothing moved around it. I called out, loudly, "Forest Service, this is Ranger Cantrell. Anyone in there?" My voice carried clearly across the clearing. There was no answer. I waited. I called again. There was no answer. I approached the cabin slowly, watching the door, watching the windows, listening. I drew my radio and confirmed it was on, although I had no signal. When I reached the door, I pushed it the rest of the way open and stepped to one side, out of the doorway, and looked in. The cabin was empty. Nothing inside had been disturbed. My pack, which I had left on the table, was where I had left it. The logbook box was closed. The stove was cold. The bunks were as I had left them, neatly made. The wool blanket folded at the foot of the lower bunk. I went inside and closed the door behind me and slid the bolt. I tested the bolt. It worked. I tested the lock. The lock worked. The door, when locked and bolted, was held firmly in place. I could not push it open. I could not pull it open by the handle. The mechanism functioned. I sat down at the table and waited for my heart to slow. After a while, I went to the logbook and opened it. There were 2 entries since mine. Both were dated October 15th. The first was timed 9:14 a.m. and was in the same handwriting as the warning from the previous book. The second was timed 2:43 p.m. and was in a different hand, one I did not recognize, also in pencil. The 9:14 a.m. entry read, "It's already with you." The 2:43 p.m. entry read, "It's already with you." The handwriting of the 2 entries was completely different. Different slant, different letter formation, different pressure on the pencil. But the words were identical. I closed the book and put it back in the box. I sat at the table for a long time. I did not write anything in my notebook for nearly an hour. When I finally did, I wrote only 5:48 p.m., returned to Greasy Cove cabin, door open on arrival, interior secure, no items disturbed. 2 logbook entries by unknown parties since previous day, bolt and lock functional, will remain overnight, will report situation upon return. I made dinner. I ate it. I did not taste much of it. The fog began to thicken outside as the light failed. By 7 p.m. I could no longer see the far edge of the clearing. I tried the radio. I got the pattern static. I switched channels. The pattern was on every channel. I switched to weather. The pattern was there too. I tried again at 7:30. Same pattern. I tried at 8 o'clock. Same. At 8:15 p.m. I thought I heard a word in the static. It was a single syllable. Short. The middle of something. I could not tell what. I held the radio close to my ear. The pattern continued, with its faint rhythm, and at 8:21 p.m. I heard another syllable. A different one. Then, at 8:23 p.m., a third. I turned the radio off. I do not know how long I sat at the table after that. I did not log it. I am writing this now from memory. At some point after dark, I heard the footsteps again. This time they did not circle the cabin. They came up to the door and stopped. I sat at the table with my flashlight off and my radio off and the stove down to embers, and I listened. There was no breathing on the other side of the door. There was no scratching. There was no sound at all after the footsteps stopped. But I could feel, in the way you sometimes feel without any external evidence, that something was standing on the other side of the door, close to it, motionless. I did not move. I did not call out. I did not turn on a light. I sat at the table and looked at the door. After what felt like a very long time, the footsteps began again, walking away from the door, around the side of the cabin, and into the fog beyond the clearing. They did not return. I checked my watch. It was 10:47 p.m. I went to the door and confirmed the bolt was thrown and the lock was engaged. They were. I sat back down at the table. I made one entry in my notebook. 10:47 p.m. Footsteps to door. No contact attempt. Withdrew west. I did not sleep that night. The morning came in slowly through the small window above the table. I had stayed at the table all night with my back to the wall and my flashlight in my hand. I had not turned the flashlight on. I had watched the door and the windows and the stove until the light changed from absolute black to dim gray, and then to a paler gray that meant the fog outside was thinning. At 7:02 a.m. I stood up. My legs were stiff. My back hurt. I made coffee. The fog cleared around 8 a.m. I went outside and walked the perimeter again. There were no tracks. I did not bother to log this. I no longer thought of the absence of tracks as something that needed explaining. I thought of it as a fact, like the weather. I had a decision to make. The remaining 2 days of patrol were supposed to involve a traverse south, along a connector trail to the upper Big East Fork. with a final descent along a different drainage back to the trailhead. The route would keep me at high elevation for most of one more day before bringing me down. It would also keep me out of radio contact for most of that time. Alternatively, I could descend the way I had come, retracing the Big East Fork Trail back to the trailhead. This would cut the patrol short by approximately a day and a half. It would leave the connector trail unsurveyed. It would also get me out. I packed my pack, I cleaned the cabin, I closed the stove damper, I checked the logbook. There were no new entries since the previous afternoon. I did not write a final entry. I put the book in the box and closed the lid. I left the cabin at 8:48 a.m. I locked the door behind me. I did not turn around to check it as I walked away. I took the Big East Fork Trail down. I made the decision while I was packing. I did not think about it for very long. I told myself that the connector trail could be surveyed the following week by another ranger or by me with a partner. I told myself that I had enough material to write a substantial report and that the unsurveyed section could be handled administratively. I told myself a number of things. The descent was uneventful for the first 2 miles. At the unnamed Feeder Creek crossing, where I had first noticed the creek that wasn't there, I did not stop. I crossed the creek without looking up the slope. I did not want to hear anything I was not ready to hear. I kept walking. The forest sounded normal. Birds, a squirrel, distant chickadees, the October woods doing what October woods do. At 11:14 a.m. I came around a bend in the trail and saw my own boot prints in the mud ahead of me. The trail had a wet section, about 10 feet across, where a small seep crossed the tread. The mud had captured prints clearly. I had crossed this section the previous morning, going up. My prints from that crossing had been on the right side of the wet area, where I had stepped to keep my boots out of the deeper mud. They had been the only prints in the wet section when I had crossed. There were now 2 sets of my prints in the mud. One set was the original, on the right side, going up. The other set was on the left side, going down. The same boot pattern, the same size, the same distinctive worn area on the right heel. I stopped at the edge of the wet section and looked at the second set of prints. They were fresh. The water had not yet seeped fully back into them. They had been made within the last few hours. I had not come down this trail. I was coming down it now for the first time since the previous morning. I had been at the Greasy Cove cabin overnight. I had not walked down this section. I could not have walked down this section. I looked behind me. There was no one. The trail going up was empty in both directions. I crossed the wet section, stepping in my original prints from the previous day, not in the new ones. On the other side, I stopped and looked back. From the new angle, I could see that the second set of prints continued down the trail, ahead of me, in the same direction I was going. I followed them. They continued for about a quarter mile, in places where the substrate was soft enough to hold a track. They moved at a normal walking pace. They did not deviate from the trail. They did not stop and rest. They did not change pace. They simply walked down the trail, in my boots, ahead of me. At a place where the trail turned sharply, the prints disappeared. I do not mean they stopped. I do not mean they faded into harder ground. I mean that at a specific point, in the middle of a stretch of clearly mud-printable trail, the prints ceased. There was no transition. The last print was a full clear print, the right boot, with the worn heel mark visible. The next stretch of mud, which would have held the following left print, held nothing. The mud beyond that point was undisturbed. I stood at the place where the prints ended for several minutes. I tried to think. I started walking again. I did not look at the trail surface after that. I reached the trailhead at 2:11 p.m. My truck was where I had parked it. The lot was empty otherwise. The keys were in my pack where I had put them. The truck started normally. The fuel gauge read the same as when I had parked. I sat in the cab with the engine running for a long time before I put it in gear. I drove out the Forest Service road slowly. The fog had cleared completely by then, and the afternoon light was soft and slanted through the trees. I passed a pickup with 2 hunters in orange vests heading the other way. We waved at each other through the windshields, the small acknowledgement that people who live in these mountains give each other. They looked normal. I do not know what I looked like to them. I reached the district office at 3:48 p.m. I went inside. The dispatcher, a woman named Carla who had been with the district for 8 years, looked up from her desk when I came in. "You're back early," she said. "I am," I said. "Everything all right?" I sat down in the chair across from her desk. I put my pack on the floor. I looked at her for a moment before I answered. "I need to file a report," I said. She nodded. About the patrol." She got up and made me a cup of coffee from the small machine in the corner. She brought it to me. I drank it. We talked briefly about the storm damage I had observed. I told her about the blowdowns and the eroded sections. I told her the bridge at Sunburst was fine. I told her I had not made it to the connector trail and that the upper Big East Fork remained unsurveyed. She wrote it down. She did not ask why I had not surveyed the connector trail. I went into my office and I sat at my desk and I tried to write the rest of the report. I worked on it for about 2 hours. I wrote about the trail conditions. I wrote about the bridge. I wrote about the radio interference. I wrote about the pattern static. I described the audio anomalies in technical terms: footsteps audible at locations consistent with patrol perimeter, vocal events audible at distances exceeding line of sight, trail morphology discrepancy at known landmark. I made it sound like an environmental incident report. I made it sound like the kind of thing that gets filed and reviewed and noted in a database somewhere and that eventually contributes to some larger pattern of regional observation that other rangers in other years might find useful. I did not write about the logbook entries. I did not write about my own boot prints in the mud. I did not write about the door that I had locked twice being open when I returned. I did not write about the sense which I had felt sitting at the table in the cabin at 10:47 p.m. the previous night, that something was standing on the other side of the door looking in. I told myself that none of those things would be useful in a professional report. I told myself that they would only invite scrutiny. They would prompt questions about my fitness for the job. They would be misinterpreted by anyone who had not been there. They would do no one any good. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I did not want to write any of it down in any document that would be part of the official record. I did not want it to exist in writing where someone else might read it and ask me to elaborate. I did not want to give it that kind of permanence. I filed the partial report at 6:14 p.m. I drove home. I live in a small house outside Brevard, on a rented lot at the end of a quiet road. I went inside. I turned on every light in the house. I locked the doors. I sat in my living room with a beer that I did not drink, and I tried to think about ordinary things. I went to sleep with the bedroom light on. I dreamed nothing that I remember. In the days after I returned, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I spoke with Roy Bradley about the bridge. He was apologetic. He said he had filed the report based on what another crew member had described, that he had not been to the site himself, that there must have been some confusion about which bridge had been damaged. He said he would follow up. He did not seem surprised when I told him the bridge was fine. He was an honest man, and he treated his mistake honestly. I spoke with Carla about the radio interference. She checked the logs from the repeater for the days in question. There was nothing unusual, no reported outages, no maintenance events. The repeater had been working normally throughout my patrol. She offered to have the repeater inspected anyway. I told her not to bother. I did not speak to anyone about the logbook entries. I went back to the Greasy Cove cabin once. It was a week after my patrol. I had a half day of administrative time and I drove out to the trailhead in the morning and hiked the 4 miles in. I did not need to go. There was no work scheduled at the cabin. I went because I wanted to look at the logbook. The cabin was unlocked when I arrived. I do not know why this surprised me. The cabin should have been locked. I had locked it when I left the previous week. Cabins in this district are always supposed to be locked between uses. I had the key in my pocket. I checked the door. The bolt was unlocked. The lock was unlocked. The door swung open easily. I went inside. Everything was as I had left it. I went to the logbook. The pages with the warning and the 2 identical entries were gone. The notebook had been carefully cut near the binding in a way that left no obvious sign unless you knew the pages were missing. The page numbers, which I had not noticed before but which were faintly stamped on each page, jumped from 47 to 52. 5 pages were missing. The pages that should have contained my entries from October 14th and 15th, the previous trail cruise entries, the warning, and the 2 identical entries. I sat at the table for a while. My own field notebook, which I had carried with me on the patrol and which had been in my office desk drawer for the past week, still contained my entries. I had read them over several times. They had not changed. I had photocopied the relevant pages and put the copies in a folder in my desk and the original notebook in a drawer at home. I left the cabin at 1:30 p.m. I locked the door behind me. I walked out to the trailhead and drove back to the district office. I did not file a report about the missing logbook pages. I worked the rest of the season normally. I requested, and was granted, a transfer to a different section of the district for the following spring. The transfer involved a slight reduction in responsibility and a corresponding reduction in pay. My supervisor asked why. I told her I wanted to focus on a different terrain type. She did not press the question. I have not been back to Greasy Cove or to the Shining Rock Ridge since. I am writing this from my kitchen table on the evening of October 14th, 1 year later. I do not know why I am writing it. I have no intention of submitting it as part of any report. I have no intention of showing it to anyone. The notebook in which I am writing is a plain composition book that I bought at a hardware store in Brevard last month, and when I am done with it I will probably put it in the same drawer where the original field notebook is kept. In the back of the dresser in my bedroom, behind a stack of old tax forms. I am writing it because the year has gone by, and because I have been trying the whole year to find a way to think about what happened that does not require me to believe any one specific thing. I have considered the possibility that I was experiencing some kind of medical event, a stress reaction, a perceptual disorder, the early stages of an illness that has not yet declared itself. I have had a physical examination. I have had blood work. I have had a neurological consult. Everything was normal. The doctor was gentle. He told me that perceptual experiences in the woods, especially in fatigue and isolation, are more common than people generally realize. He told me that the brain, under those conditions, can produce a variety of strong impressions that are not necessarily indicative of any underlying problem. He suggested that I take a few weeks off from field work. I took the weeks off. I went back to work. I have considered the possibility that something in the environment of the Shining Rock area, some atmospheric condition, some geological condition, some combination of acoustics and air and weather, produced a specific cluster of perceptual effects that I happened to experience during my 4-day patrol. The Appalachians are old mountains. They have unusual geology. They produce unusual weather. Strange acoustic phenomena have been reported in mountains all over the world. There are scientific papers on the subject. I have read some of them. They are interesting. They do not explain footsteps that circle a cabin without leaving tracks. They do not explain logbook entries in 2 different hands containing the same 5 words. They do not explain a second set of my own boot prints on a trail I had not yet walked. I have considered the possibility that someone was deliberately doing these things. A person or a small group of people working to disturb me for reasons I cannot imagine. I have considered who would have the knowledge, the patience, the opportunity. I have come up with no one. The patrol was assigned to me on short notice. The schedule was internal. The Greasy Cove cabin was unlocked only with a USFS key. The trails are difficult and remote, and a sustained campaign of deception across 48 hours and 20 miles of terrain, conducted by someone leaving no tracks at all, is a very strange thing to imagine. I have considered the possibility that I am misremembering, that the events as I have written them did not happen exactly as I have described them, that the pattern static was only ordinary static, that the silence at the junction was only an unusual quiet stretch, that the footsteps around the cabin were a bear after all, and that the missing flat area was a navigational error. I have considered this carefully. I have read and reread my field notebook. The notes are clear. The notes are written in the calm, observational style I have used for 11 years. They do not read like the notes of a person hallucinating. They read like the notes of a person trying very hard to be honest about things that were happening around him. I do not know what was happening. What I do know is that for the 4 days of that patrol, and especially for the 2 nights at the cabin, I was in the company of something that was both there and not there. Something that walked but left no tracks. Something that wrote but did not exist. Something that arrived at the door of the cabin and stopped and waited and then went away without ever making itself known. Something that was, by every measurable standard, not present, and that was nonetheless present in some way I have no word for throughout the patrol. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in monsters. I do not believe in cryptids or demons or any of the other things that the popular imagination supplies for incidents of this kind. I have spent my professional life in the Appalachian woods, and I know how those woods can fool a person. I know how fog and fatigue and isolation can produce experiences that feel completely real and that are nonetheless not real. I also know that some experiences are not produced by fog and fatigue and isolation. I have had those experiences too, the ordinary ones, and I know the difference. The patrol of October 14th through 17th last year was not one of those experiences. What it was, I cannot say. I have been told, by colleagues who have heard pieces of this story, that other rangers have had similar incidents in the Shining Rock area. I have been told this in a casual way, by men who did not want to elaborate. I have not pressed them. I have not asked for details. I am not sure I want to know whether what happened to me is part of a pattern. I am no longer assigned to that section of the district. I do not go up there even on personal time. I used to hike the shining rock ridge for pleasure, on weekends in the long evenings of summer. I do not do that anymore. I hike other ridges now, in other parts of the forest, and I make myself not think about the one I no longer visit. Sometimes I succeed. The October air is cold tonight and the leaves outside my kitchen window are coming down. The wind is steady from the west. I can hear it moving through the bare branches of the dogwood in my yard. It sounds the way it should sound. It sounds the way wind always sounds in an Appalachian October, dry and clean and a little lonely. I sit at the table and I listen to it and I am, for the most part, all right. But there are nights, here in this house, 80 miles from the cabin, when I wake up at some hour I do not check, and I lie in the bed in the dark and I listen, and I hear something I cannot quite name, a pause in the wind perhaps, a space between the ordinary sounds, nothing definite, nothing I could put in a report. I lie there and I listen until I fall asleep again, or until the morning comes, whichever happens first. It has not stopped. I do not believe it will stop. I am writing this down because I think that one day I will not be the person writing about it. One day I think it will be the only thing left, and someone else will be reading these pages and trying to make sense of them, and I want that person to know that I tried, for the year between the patrol and this writing, to find an explanation. I tried. I did not find one. My name is Daniel Brooks. I am 41 years old. I have worked as a backcountry ranger in the Monongahela National Forest for the past 17 years, with the last 9 of those assigned primarily to the Cranberry Wilderness sector in the eastern half of Pocahontas County, West Virginia. My duties include trail maintenance verification, late-season patrol rotations, equipment audits at remote shelters, and any incident response that originates from my assigned zone. I am writing this now, several months after the events I will describe, because I was instructed to produce a complete personal account by my supervisor, and because I have not been able to file the standard incident report in any form that I am willing to sign my name to. I should say at the outset that I am not a man inclined toward exaggeration. I keep neat logs. I check my watch often. I file my paperwork on time. My field notebooks from the past 9 seasons are stacked in a banker's box in the corner of my kitchen, and if anyone wanted to verify the kind of language I use to describe even unusual events, they could open any of those notebooks and find phrases like small mammal, unidentified, brushy, or wind from northwest, gusting, intermittent, written in the same hand. I do not write words like wrong or impossible in my notebooks. I am writing them here because I have not yet been able to find any other word that describes what happened during the week of October 14th through October 21st. The assignment that week was routine. I was to conduct the end-of-season audit on 3 backcountry shelters along the upper sections of the Middle Fork Trail system, verify the condition of the trail markers between them, and confirm that the radio repeater at Sawyer Ridge was still receiving and transmitting at acceptable levels before winter closures began on November 1st. I was given 7 nights of provisions. My pack weighed 46 pounds with water. I left the Cranberry Station at 6:48 a.m. on the morning of the 14th and signed out with the desk officer, who I will call B, because I have been asked not to use the names of colleagues in this account. I expected to return on the afternoon of the 21st. The first day was uneventful. I covered approximately 11 miles by a slow pace, stopping to clear a small blowdown at the 4.2-mile marker with a folding saw and to photograph a section of trail tread where last spring's washout had begun to gully more than I had remembered from my July patrol. The weather was mild for October at that elevation, high 40s in the morning, low 60s by midday, falling back to the 40s as the sun moved off the ridges. The leaves were past peak. The canopy was about half bare and the floor of the woods was thick with wet maple and oak leaves that gave under the boot with a sound I have heard so many times in this part of the country that I no longer hear it when it is happening. I want to mention that because the absence of that sound becomes relevant later. I reached the first shelter, which I will refer to as Shelter 1, at 4:11 p.m. It is a 3-sided lean-to with a corrugated metal roof, set about 30 yards off the trail at a small clearing where the topography flattens out before the next climb. The shelter was in the condition I expected. The fire ring had been cleaned out by the last party through, which I appreciated. There was a damp logbook in the tin canister bolted to the lean-to's rear wall. I read through the most recent entries while I boiled water for my dinner. The last entry was dated September 30th, signed by 2 thru-hikers who reported a great night, owls everywhere. The entry before that was August 22nd. Nothing about the logbook seemed unusual to me at the time. I want to be precise about my procedures because I think the precision matters. After dinner, I walked the perimeter of the clearing with my headlamp on red. I checked the trail markers in both directions at the junction. I confirmed the orientation of the shelter against my map. I noted my arrival time, the temperature, the wind direction, and a brief observation about the leaf litter in my notebook. I hung my food bag from the cable provided. I went to sleep at approximately 8:30 p.m. I woke at 2:14 a.m. I know it was 2:14 a.m. because the first thing I did when I woke was check the watch I keep on a lanyard around my neck inside my sleeping bag. I woke because I heard a sound and I could not immediately identify what the sound had been. I lay still for several minutes listening. The forest was very quiet. I could hear water moving somewhere down the slope, and the small sounds of my own breath and a single creak from the metal roof of the shelter as it adjusted to the cooling air. I waited. After about 10 minutes I heard the sound again, and this time I was awake enough to recognize it. It was the sound of a boot stepping on wet leaves. One step, then another step, then nothing. I waited a long time after that. I did not hear any further steps. After perhaps 20 minutes I sat up, turned on my headlamp, and shone the beam slowly across the clearing in the direction the steps had seemed to come from. I saw nothing. The clearing was empty. I noted the time, the sounds, and the absence of any visual confirmation in my notebook. I went back to sleep at approximately 3:05 a.m. I want to be clear that I did not consider this incident remarkable at the time. 2 footsteps in the night, in a wilderness shelter, at an elevation of approximately 3,800 feet, with deer and bear and the occasional coyote moving through the area regularly, is not an event that any ranger of my experience would treat as remarkable. I am only describing it in this kind of detail because of what came afterward. At the time I wrote 4 lines about it in my notebook and went back to sleep. I left Shelter 1 at 7:22 a.m. on October 15th. The morning was foggy, with visibility down to perhaps 40 yards in the lower sections of the trail. I made a slower pace than the day before, partly because of the fog and partly because the trail dropped down through a long section of rhododendron tunnel where the tread becomes slick and the roots want your ankles. By mid-morning the fog had lifted enough that I could see the slope rising to my right, and I stopped at 10:43 a.m. to drink water and check my map. I was at approximately the 7-mile mark on the second day's segment, which would put me about 11 miles short of Shelter 2. I want to describe what I heard at 10:43 a.m. because I think it is the first observation I made on the trip that I cannot now explain with anything I am willing to commit to in writing. I was sitting on a flat stone next to the trail, drinking water from my Nalgene, and somewhere up the slope to my right I heard a voice. The voice was speaking in normal, conversational tones. It was not a shout, and it was not close enough to make out individual words. It sounded like the way a person sounds when they are talking to a companion on the other side of a hill. Clearly a human voice, clearly forming sentences, clearly not addressed to me. I listened. The voice continued for perhaps 15 seconds and then stopped. I waited. I heard it again, maybe 30 seconds later, and then again after another similar pause. The cadence of the speech was steady and the tone was even. It sounded, to use a phrase I have hesitated to write, like someone reading aloud. My first thought was that there were other hikers on a parallel trail or perhaps a forestry crew working on a logging road further up. I am familiar enough with the geography of that section to know that neither of those explanations was correct. The nearest parallel trail is more than 3 miles to the north over difficult terrain. The nearest logging road that might support a crew is more than 5 miles east and on the far side of a creek drainage. I considered the possibility of sound carrying unusual distances through the cooler morning air, which it sometimes does, particularly in valleys. I considered the possibility that I was hearing my own pulse through the contact of my ear against the rim of my Nalgene, which I have experienced before. I put the Nalgene down and listened again. The voice continued. I noted the time and the direction of the sound, which was approximately west-southwest, up the slope, at an elevation I estimated to be 80 to 100 feet above me. After about 4 or 5 minutes of listening, I made the decision to climb up the slope and see if I could identify a source. I am a ranger, that is part of my job. If there were hikers in difficulty, or if there was an unauthorized camp on a federal wilderness, I needed to know. I left my pack at the trail with my hat on top of it as a marker and started up the slope. The slope was steep, but not impossible. There was no developed trail in that direction. I climbed for approximately 25 minutes, gaining maybe 200 feet of elevation, and during the entire climb I continued to hear the voice, at intervals, with the same even cadence, from a direction that as I climbed toward it, did not seem to change in the way that it should have if it were a fixed source. The voice always seemed to be coming from approximately the same distance ahead of me and at approximately the same elevation above me. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened when I reached the top of the rise. I reached a small flat area where the slope leveled out for perhaps 15 yards before continuing upward. The forest here was open, with mature oak and hickory, and visibility was good. There was nobody on the rise. There was no campsite. There were no tracks. The voice was no longer audible from the rise itself. I stood there for several minutes listening, turning slowly, and I could not hear anything at all. There was no wind, there were no birds, there was no water sound, there were no insect sounds. The forest around me was completely silent. I was familiar with this kind of stillness from other patrols, particularly in cold morning hours when the woods seem to pause before they begin their day. But the duration of this silence felt longer than I expected. I noted the time. It was 11:31 a.m. I waited another full minute by my watch, and during that minute I heard absolutely nothing. Then a single chickadee called from somewhere downslope, and the silence ended. I made my way back down to the trail. My pack was where I had left it. I checked my notebook to confirm that I had written down the original time of the observation, and I added a short note about what I had heard and what I had not found. I should mention that I did not put a question mark anywhere in my notebook entry. I have a habit of writing question marks when I am unsure of something, and the fact that I did not use one in that entry now strikes me as interesting because I was unsure. I think I was already at that point beginning to keep the notebook in a way that I could later defend. I covered another 6 miles before I made camp. I reached a small dispersed site near a side creek at 4:55 p.m. and decided to stop there rather than push on to Shelter 2, partly because I was tired and partly because I had spent more time on the slope than I had planned. I set up a tarp and a sleeping pad, boiled water, and ate a hot meal. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. I went to sleep around 8 p.m. I did not hear any voices that night. I did, however, wake up at 1:46 a.m. because of a sound that I initially thought was a tree branch falling. I sat up and listened, and after perhaps a minute I heard the same sound again. It was a single, sharp knock, as if someone had struck a tree trunk once with the back of an axe. I waited. I did not hear it again. I noted the time and the description in my notebook. I went back to sleep. The morning of October 16th was clear. I broke camp early, at 6:39 a.m., and pushed to make up some of the distance I had lost the day before. The trail climbed steadily through a section of older second-growth forest, then leveled out along a long ridgeline that I had walked many times. The trail markers along that ridge are familiar to me. There are 17 of them between 2 specific landmarks. A large flat-topped boulder at the south end of the ridge, which is the kind of rock that hikers stop at to eat lunch, and a stand of 3 large red spruces clustered together at the north end. Between those 2 landmarks I have counted 17 markers on every patrol I have ever made along that ridge. That is not because I count them for any particular reason. It is because I have made the same observation enough times that I know the number without thinking about it. I counted 18 markers on October 16th. I am going to take a moment here to explain what I mean by markers because the precision matters. The markers along this section are simple painted blazes on the trunks of trees 2 by 6 inches, in standard Forest Service yellow. They are placed by trail crews on a rotational maintenance schedule. They are repainted approximately every 5 to 7 years. They are not added casually. When a new marker is placed, it is recorded in the trail maintenance log at the district office. When a marker is removed or replaced, it is also recorded. I have access to those logs because I have worked on the maintenance crews myself. I counted 18 markers between the boulder and the spruces. I counted them once going north while I was walking. I noticed the extra one because the count did not feel right at the end of the segment, but I had not been paying close enough attention to know where the extra one had been. I stopped at the spruces, drank some water, and then walked back south and counted again slowly, this time touching each blaze with my hand as I passed it. 18. I walked the segment a third time, going north again, and this time I marked the location of every blaze in my notebook by approximate distance from the boulder. I recorded the 18 markers as being at 12 yards, 47 yards, 89 yards, 134 yards, 178 yards, 215 yards, 261 yards, 309 yards, 348 yards, 401 yards, 442 yards, 489 yards, 533 yards, 581 yards, 6,206 yards, 6,072 yards, 718 yards, and 759 yards. These are estimates made by pace count and they are not exact. I am not certain which of the 18 I had not seen before. I did not radio in the discrepancy. I have thought about this many times since. I am not sure why I did not radio in the discrepancy. The reason I gave myself at the time was that I would have to verify it against the maintenance log when I returned to the station, and the discrepancy might simply turn out to be a count I had been making wrong for years. The actual reason, I think, was something different. I was beginning to feel that I did not want to attach my voice to a radio frequency and say out loud the thing I had observed. That is the most honest way I can describe it. I reached Shelter 2 at 2:08 p.m. The shelter was in good condition. The fire ring was clean. I performed my inspection. I checked the cable system, the moisture barrier on the bunks, the condition of the roof, and the contents of the small emergency cache, which was intact. I refilled my water from the spring about 40 yards down the path, which was flowing steadily. I cooked an early dinner and made my notebook entries. I want to describe what happened that evening. I am still not entirely certain how to characterize it. At 6:14 p.m., with the light dropping but still good, I was sitting on the edge of the shelter platform reading a paperback I had brought with me. I had my back to the rear wall of the shelter, and I was facing out into the clearing. I noticed motion at the far edge of the clearing, on the trail side, approximately 40 yards away. The motion was at ground level. It was the kind of motion that catches the eye and then resolves, when you look at it directly, into something ordinary, a squirrel, or a fallen leaf in a draft of wind, or the shadow of a branch. I looked at it directly. It did not resolve. I watched the spot for perhaps 30 seconds and saw nothing further. I went back to my book. A minute later, I noticed motion at the same spot. I looked up. There was nothing there. I watched for another half minute. Nothing. This happened, by my count, 6 times over the next 40 minutes. Always at the same spot. Always at the edge of my peripheral vision. Always nothing when I looked at it directly. I marked the spot in my mind by a particular small sapling near the trail intersection. After the 6th occurrence, I got up, walked across the clearing, and examined the area around the sapling for any sign that an animal had been moving through. There were old deer tracks in the soft earth near the trail. There was nothing fresh. I returned to the shelter. I should mention that I am familiar with the way the human eye works. I know that the periphery is more sensitive to motion than the center, and that an experienced field worker can sometimes see motion in low light conditions when there is none, particularly if they are tired. I had been on the trail for 3 days. I was tired. I noted in my notebook that I had been seeing motion in my peripheral vision that did not resolve when I looked at it directly, and that this was likely due to fatigue and lighting conditions. I underlined the words lighting conditions twice. I am not entirely sure why I underlined them. I went to sleep at 9:14 p.m. I slept through the night without waking. I woke on the morning of October 17th to a fog so thick that I could not see the trees at the edge of the clearing from the shelter. I have seen this kind of fog many times in this part of the country. It is not unusual at all in October. What was unusual was the silence. I sat on the platform and listened for what I would call the normal morning sounds of a wet, foggy forest. Dripping water, settling branches, the small movements of birds beginning their day. I heard none of these things. I heard my own breathing. I heard the small sound of my watch ticking against the strap of my pack. I heard nothing else. I want to be careful here. Forest silence is not unusual on its own. A still, foggy morning can suppress sound. Cold air can compress the soundscape and make distant sources inaudible. I know this. But the silence I sat in that morning was different in a way I am going to try to describe and probably fail to describe correctly. It was not that the sounds were quiet or distant. It was that they were absent, as if the air itself had been removed and replaced with something that did not carry sound. I sat there for perhaps 10 minutes and listened. I did not hear a single bird. I did not hear a single drip from a wet branch onto the leaf litter, even though the fog was condensing visibly on everything. I did not hear water moving in the spring 40 yards downslope. I checked my watch. It was 7:02 a.m. I made a note in my notebook. Heavy fog, complete acoustic absence, possibly atmospheric, will reassess on the move. I packed up my camp. I shouldered my pack. I started down the trail. The silence stayed with me. I do not mean that figuratively. I mean that for approximately the first 90 minutes of my hike on the morning of the 17th, I walked through a forest in which I could not hear anything except the sound of my own boots on the trail and the sound of my own breathing. The boots were loud. They were loud in the way that a single noise becomes loud when it is the only noise in the world. I tried whistling at one point, just to hear my own whistle. The whistle sounded thin and immediate, with no echo at all, as if I were whistling in a soundproofed room. At 8:34 a.m. I heard a chickadee. It was the first sound from the forest I had heard that morning. I want to describe what happened in the next 30 seconds because I have thought about it more than I have thought about any other moment of that week. The chickadee called, then another bird, somewhere further down the slope, called. Then I heard wind move through the canopy above me. Then I heard water moving in the drainage to my left, which I had been walking parallel to for the previous 20 minutes without hearing it at all. The forest came back, all at once, in less than half a minute. It was as if a curtain had been lifted. I stopped on the trail and stood completely still for several minutes, listening to the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. I have rarely been so grateful for ordinary sounds. I made a note in my notebook. I underlined nothing. I covered approximately 8 miles that day. I reached the spur trail to Shelter 3 at 3:47 p.m. The spur is about 3/4 of a mile long, climbing through a steep section of laurel and rhododendron before opening out into the small flat where the shelter sits. I have walked this spur many times. I know its turns and its rises and the particular places where the tread becomes troublesome. I know that the spur trail crosses a small intermittent creek at a point I would estimate at approximately 400 yards from the main trail intersection, and that the crossing is marked by a single flat stone laid across the creek bed as a step. On October 17th, the stone was not there. I want to be clear. I did not assume initially that the stone had been removed. I assumed initially that I had remembered the location incorrectly, or that I had not yet reached the crossing, or that the creek was in a slightly different location than I remembered. I continued up the spur for another 200 yards looking for the creek. I did not find it. I went back and looked again. The creek bed was where it had always been. The trail was where it had always been. The stone was not. There was a depression in the wet earth at the edge of the creek where I would have expected the stone to be. The depression was clean and free of leaves. It looked like the place where a stone had been recently lifted. I want to be very careful here. I am not saying that the stone had been recently lifted. I am saying that the depression looked to me like the place where a stone had been recently lifted. The stone itself was not visible anywhere in the immediate vicinity of the creek crossing. I looked downstream for perhaps 30 yards and upstream for the same. I did not find the stone. I stepped across the creek without it. I continued up the spur. I reached Shelter 3 at 4:38 p.m. I performed my inspection. The shelter was in good condition. I made my notebook entries. I cooked dinner. I did not radio in the missing stone. I have thought about that many times also. I slept poorly at Shelter 3 on the night of October 17th and the early morning of October 18th. I want to describe my sleep pattern that night in some detail because the time inconsistencies that I noticed in my notebook on the morning of the 18th seem to have begun during that night. I went to sleep at 8:51 p.m. I am confident of that time because I noted it in my notebook before turning off my headlamp. I have a habit of noting my sleep time. I woke for the first time at 11:14 p.m., which I know because I checked my watch immediately upon waking. I do not know what woke me. I lay still for perhaps 15 minutes, listening, and then went back to sleep. I woke for the second time at what my watch read as 1:42 a.m. I had a strong impression that I had been asleep for a long time, and that the sky outside the shelter was just beginning to lighten toward dawn. The impression was strong enough that I sat up and looked out. The clearing was completely dark. There was no moon and no light at all in the sky. I looked at my watch again to confirm the time. 1:42 a.m. I considered the possibility that I had been dreaming about dawn and had carried the dream impression into waking. I lay back down. I woke for the third time at 4:04 a.m. I lay still and listened. The forest was active in a normal way. The small sounds of branches, the call of an owl somewhere distant, the quiet wind in the spruces. I felt very awake. I decided to get up and make coffee. I lit my stove. I boiled water. I made coffee. I sat on the platform and drank it. I checked my watch. It was 4:11 a.m. The coffee took, by my own actions, approximately 20 minutes to prepare and drink. My watch had advanced 7 minutes. I have considered every possible explanation for this. The most likely explanation is that I am wrong about how long the coffee took. The second most likely explanation is that I checked my watch at the beginning and at the end of the coffee at moments closer together than I remembered. I do not know whether either of those explanations is correct. I noted in my notebook the time the coffee began and the time the coffee ended. I wrote, "Coffee, 0411-0418. Felt longer. I added nothing else. The sun rose at 7:31 a.m. I packed up my camp. I left Shelter 3 at 8:04 a.m., heading back toward the main trail by the spur. I will say now that the spur trail had not, as far as I could tell on my way down, returned the stone to its place at the creek crossing. There was still a clean depression at the edge of the creek bed. There was still no stone visible anywhere nearby. I stepped across without it. The plan for October 18th was to head north along the ridge toward the radio repeater at Sawyer Ridge, perform the check, and then double back to camp at the dispersed site I had used on the night of the 15th. The repeater is about 4 miles north of the main trail junction. I expected to reach it by midday and to be back to the dispersed site by late afternoon. I reached the repeater at 11:48 a.m. The repeater is a small steel structure on a concrete pad, fenced with a low chain link surround, antennas mounted on a guide mast about 30 feet high. The fence has a gate that is locked with a key carried by all assigned rangers in the sector. I unlocked the gate. I performed the standard check. I confirmed that the indicator lights were green, that the battery voltage was within range, that the antenna mounts were not damaged, that the grounding was intact, and that the access log inside the small weatherproof box on the side of the structure was current. I made my entry in the access log, my name, the date, the time, and a note that all systems were nominal. I radioed the station from the repeater pad. The repeater is the most reliable radio location in the sector. The connection was clean. I spoke to B at the desk. I confirmed my position, my schedule, and the status of the repeater. B asked if I had anything to report. I said no. I want to record that. I said no. After the radio check, I sat on the pad and ate lunch. I left the repeater at 12:31 p.m. I closed and locked the gate behind me. It was on the walk back, somewhere between the repeater and the Ridge Trail intersection, that I began to notice the radio anomaly. My handheld was set to the standard monitoring frequency and the volume was at a level where I would normally hear nothing but very occasional static. Beginning at approximately 1:15 p.m., I began to hear, every few minutes, a brief burst of static, accompanied by what sounded like a fragment of speech. The fragments were short, never longer than 2 or 3 seconds, and the speech was always unclear. It sounded like a single voice. The voice was not B's voice, and was not any voice I recognized. I assumed initially that I was picking up bleed over from a private radio, perhaps a hunter's handheld on a similar frequency. I stopped on the trail to listen more carefully. The fragments came at irregular intervals. They were not from a private channel that I could identify. The cadence and tone of the speech, in the brief moments I could hear it, sounded like the same cadence and tone I had heard from the slope on the morning of October 15th. I want to be careful about that observation. I am aware that pattern recognition can become unreliable when fatigue and isolation are factors. I am aware that I had begun to listen for similarities. I write that observation now because it was the observation I made at the time. I noted it in my notebook. I wrote, "Static fragments, possible voice, similar to 10:15 observation, unverified." The fragments continued intermittently for approximately the next 2 hours. I turned the volume down. The fragments became inaudible. I did not turn the volume back up. I camped on the night of October 18th at the same dispersed site I had used on the night of the 15th, near the side creek. I want to record that the campsite looked exactly as I had left it. The small pile of brush I had pushed off the flat sleeping area was still where I had pushed it. The fire ring I had constructed on the night of the 15th was still intact. There were no signs that anyone had used the site between my 2 visits, which was unsurprising because the site is not on any official map and is only used occasionally by experienced backcountry travelers who know the area. I want to describe the night of October 18th carefully. It is the night during which I made the most extensive notes of any night during the trip, and the night during which I came closest to abandoning the patrol. I went to sleep at 8:39 p.m. I woke at 10:51 p.m. because I heard a knock. It was a single sharp knock, similar to the one I had heard at the same site on the night of the 15th. I sat up and listened. The forest was quiet. After perhaps 2 minutes I heard a second knock. It came from a different direction than the first one. I sat very still. I did not turn on my headlamp. The first knock had come from somewhere downslope, toward the creek. The second knock had come from somewhere upslope, in the opposite direction. The interval between them was perhaps 3 minutes. I waited. After another similar interval, I heard a third knock. It came from a direction roughly perpendicular to the first 2, off to my left perhaps 30 yards into the trees. After the third knock, the knocks continued at intervals of 2 to 4 minutes. from different directions, for approximately the next 2 hours. I am not certain of the total count. I stopped writing them down in my notebook after the 11th. I want to record what I did not hear during those 2 hours. I did not hear any movement between the knocks. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear any disturbance of leaves or branches. I did not hear any vocalization that might have indicated an animal. The knocks themselves sounded like the same single source, the same pitch, the same duration, the same character, as if the same hand were striking the same wooden surface with the same force. But the knocks came from different directions, separated by more distance than any human or animal could have crossed silently in the time available between them. I considered several explanations. I considered the possibility that there were multiple people in the woods around me coordinating the sounds. I considered the possibility that the knocks were the natural sounds of trees cracking in the cold, which can sometimes happen as wood contracts, and that I was attributing pattern to coincidence. I considered the possibility that I was experiencing an auditory hallucination of some kind, perhaps related to sleep deprivation. I want to record that I considered each of these explanations seriously and was unable, at the time and now, to fully accept any of them. The knocks stopped at approximately 1 a.m. I am not sure of the exact time because I was no longer checking my watch with any regularity. After they stopped, I lay awake for a long time waiting for them to resume. They did not. At some point I fell asleep. I woke at 5:47 a.m. I sat up. The first thing I did was check my notebook. My notebook entries from the previous night were where I had written them. I read them. I want to describe one specific observation about my own notebook. The entries are written in pencil. I write in pencil in the field because pencil does not run in wet conditions. My pencil that morning was where I had left it, lying on top of the notebook, with the point still sharpened from when I had last used it. The point was not worn. The graphite was not smudged. The pages I had written on the previous night looked exactly as I would have expected them to look. The handwriting was mine. I mention this because I had been afraid, when I sat up, that the entries would not be there. I do not have a rational explanation for that fear. I had written the entries. I had felt the pencil in my hand. I had no reason to expect them to be missing. But I had been afraid that they would be. I noted that fear in my notebook. I underlined nothing. I packed up my camp at 6:30 a.m. I decided that morning that I would shorten my patrol and return to the Cranberry Station a day early. I did not radio in this decision because I had decided to stay off the radio. I planned my route back, an 11-mile day on the 19th to Shelter 1, a final stop at the trail register, and then the 7 miles out to the trailhead on the 20th. I would be home a day ahead of schedule. The change in plan felt reasonable to me. The change in plan still feels reasonable to me. I made it for reasons I have not been able to fully articulate. The walk on October 19th was the most difficult day of the trip. The terrain itself was unchanged from any other patrol I had made along that section. The weather was good. I was rested. The difficulty was inside. I left the dispersed site at 6:48 a.m. I made good time for the first 3 miles. At approximately the 4-mile mark, I came to a section of trail that runs along a slow bench above a small drainage. The trail there is wide and easy, and I had walked it perhaps 30 times in my career. I am familiar with it. On the morning of October 19th, at approximately 9 a.m., I came to the bench section and discovered that the trail had been bent. I do not have a better word for it. The trail itself, the visible tread, the worn path on the ground, was where I expected it to be for approximately the first 100 yards. Then it bent to the left in a direction it does not bend. I stopped. I looked at the trail. The blazes on the trees ahead of me continued in the bent direction. The bent direction took the trail uphill and to the west, when I knew with absolute certainty that the trail at that point ran along a level bench to the north. I want to be very specific. I am not describing a trail that I was mistaken about. I am describing a trail that, after I had walked it many times in many seasons, looked different on October 19th than it had looked on every previous occasion. I stood at the bend and tried to orient myself with my map. The map showed the trail running north along the bench. The blazes on the trees showed the trail bending west and uphill. The tread on the ground was consistent with the blazes. I want to record the next part because it is important. I followed the bent trail. I followed it for approximately 20 minutes. The blazes were correctly placed and recently maintained. The tread was clean. The trail climbed gently to the west. After 20 minutes I came to a clearing I did not recognize, and in the clearing there was a flat-topped boulder, of the kind that hikers stop at to eat lunch. I stood at the boulder for a long time. I want to describe what I did not do. I did not panic. I did not run. I did not look for footprints because I was afraid of what footprints I would find. I looked at the boulder. The boulder looked, to my eye, exactly like the flat-topped boulder at the south end of the ridge above Shelter 2, where the count of 17 markers normally begins. The shape of the boulder, the orientation of the boulder, the pattern of lichen on the upper surface of the boulder. I looked at the trees around the boulder. I could see, from where I stood, the first yellow blaze on the trunk of an oak about 12 yards to the north. The blaze was in approximately the position where the first blaze on the ridge would have been. I had walked, by my pace count, more than 4 miles south of that ridge that morning. The ridge was at a higher elevation. The ridge was on the other side of 2 separate drainages. The bent trail had taken me, in 20 minutes of westward climbing, to a place that resembled a feature I had left behind hours earlier and 4 miles to the north. I sat down on the boulder. I drank water. I ate a granola bar. I thought about my options. I am writing this calmly now, and I want to say that I thought about it calmly then. I considered the possibility that I was suffering from a serious neurological event of some kind, possibly a stroke or a transient episode that was affecting my spatial perception. I considered the possibility that I had become turned around somewhere on the morning's walk and had unconsciously walked back north, which would have required me to walk past my own dispersed sight without recognizing it. I considered the possibility that the boulder was a different boulder than the one I was familiar with, and that the resemblance was coincidental. I considered the possibility that the entire bent section of trail had been there all along and I had simply never noticed it. I considered, also, the possibility that the trail had moved. I did not write that possibility in my notebook. I am writing it here in this account because I am required by my supervisor to write a complete account. At the time I sat on the boulder, I considered the possibility, and I rejected it as something that could not be true. I am not certain that I have ever fully rejected it since. I walked back down the bent trail. The bent trail on my return took me back to the bench. The bench was where it had always been. The trail ran north along the bench as it had always run. I walked the bench for another mile, found the trail in its expected condition, and continued south. I did not look behind me. I did not stop at the bend, which on my second passage was not visibly present. I do not know whether the bend was still there after I had passed it. I did not check. I reached Shelter 1 at 4:22 p.m. I made camp, I cooked dinner, I went to sleep at 7:30 p.m., which is very early for me. I slept without waking until 5:11 a.m. The walkout on October 20th should have been straightforward. 7 miles, on a well-maintained trail, with good weather. I left Shelter 1 at 6:34 a.m. I want to record one observation from the morning which I made before leaving the shelter and which I noted in my notebook at the time. The logbook in the tin canister bolted to the rear wall of the shelter had 2 new entries. The first new entry was dated October 14th. The second new entry was dated October 19th. Both entries were signed with my name. I had made the first entry on the evening of the 14th when I had stayed at Shelter 1 on my first night out. I remembered making it. The entry was in my handwriting and contained the kind of brief observation I typically make in shelter logbooks, a note about the weather, a confirmation of the shelter's good condition, my route plan for the following day. The second entry dated October 19th was also in my handwriting. The handwriting was indistinguishable from my own. The entry read, "Returning south, trip cut short, all shelters audited, conditions nominal, D. Brooks." The entry was dated October 19th at 16:30, which would have been approximately 2 hours before I arrived at Shelter 1 on the previous afternoon. I did not remember writing that entry. I want to be precise. I might have written it. I had been tired. I had made my dinner and my notebook entries and gone to bed early. I might have written a logbook entry without remembering it. People do things and forget them. I am aware of that. The handwriting was mine. The content of the entry was the kind of content I would have written. There was no reason to assume that I had not written it. The reason I am recording it here is that I had also made my standard logbook entry on the evening of the 19th, and that entry was also in the logbook, dated October 19th at 19 o'clock. The 19 o'clock entry was a normal arrival entry. My name, the time, a note about the trip being cut short, the standard formalities. The 16:30 entry, which I do not remember writing, said almost the same things. There were 2 entries from me, dated the same day, 2.5 hours apart, signed identically. I had no memory of writing the first one. I read both entries several times. I read them slowly, looking for differences. The 1630 entry was slightly more formal. The phrase "all shelters audited" was something I might have written but would more typically have phrased differently. The 19 o'clock entry was loose and natural, the kind of entry I knew I had written because I remembered writing it. I tore neither entry out. I do not even now know what I should have done. The logbook is property of the United States Forest Service. The entries in it are records. I closed the logbook and put it back in the canister. I walked out. The trail was a trail. The blazes were where they were supposed to be. The terrain was familiar. I reached the trailhead at 1:48 p.m. on October 20th, almost exactly 24 hours before I had been scheduled to arrive. My truck was where I had parked it. I drove to the station. I want to describe the conversation I had with B at the station, because it is the only conversation I had with anyone about the trip before I was assigned to write this account. I walked into the station at approximately 3:15 p.m. B was at the desk. B saw me come in and said, "You're early." I said, "Yeah," wrapped it up quick, everything checked out. B asked me how the repeater looked. I said it looked fine. B asked me if I had had any trouble on the trail. I said no. B nodded and turned back to the paperwork on the desk. I signed in. I put the keys to the repeater back in the lockbox. I left the station. I did not file an incident report. I want to say that I considered filing one and decided against it, but the truth is that I did not consider it at all. By the time I walked out of the station, I had already decided, without consciously deciding, that I was not going to write any of it down in any official form. I drove home. I unpacked my pack. I put my notebook on the kitchen table. The next morning I read through the notebook. I read every entry. I want to record that the entries were exactly as I remembered writing them, that nothing had been added to the notebook, and that nothing had been removed from it. I read it twice. I put it away. I want to describe what happened during the 3 days after I returned, because my supervisor has asked me to be complete, and because the events of those days are part of what eventually caused me to begin writing this account. On October 22nd, the day after I returned, I went to the district office to drop off my paperwork. The administrative clerk, who I will call M, handed me a small stack of forms to sign. One of the forms was a copy of my radio log from the trip. I want to describe the radio log. The radio log is maintained at the station by whoever is on the desk at the time of each transmission. B had been on the desk for my repeater check on October 18th. The log entry from that check, dated October 18th, timestamped 12:04 p.m., recorded that I had radioed in from the repeater and confirmed nominal status. That entry matched my own recollection. There was a second entry on the log, dated October 18th, timestamped 14:42. The second entry recorded that I had radioed in from a position south of the repeater and had reported what the log described as unidentified static, low priority, no action required. I had not radioed in at 14:42 on October 18th. I had been on the trail. I had not used my radio at all that afternoon except to monitor it. I had not transmitted. I looked at the log entry. I looked at it for a long time. M asked me if there was a problem. I said no. I signed the form. I went back to my truck and sat in the parking lot for some time. I do not remember how long. I want to record one specific thought I had during that time because it is the thought that I have had most often since. I had said to B, when I had returned to the station, that I had had no trouble on the trail. I had not radioed in any trouble during the trip itself. The log entry at 14:42 on October 18th, which I had not made, recorded that I had radioed in unidentified static. The entry was consistent with what had actually happened to me on the trail. The entry described, almost exactly, the radio anomaly I had recorded in my notebook and chosen not to report. I had not reported it. The log entry was there. Someone had reported it on my behalf. I considered the possibility that B had made the entry in error, perhaps confusing me with another ranger. There was no other ranger on patrol in the sector that week. I considered the possibility that the timestamp had been incorrectly recorded, and that the entry referred to a different transmission. There was no other transmission. I considered the possibility that I had transmitted and forgotten. I do not believe that I transmitted. I drove home. I did not go back to the station the next day. I called in and said I needed a day. M said that was fine. On October 24th, I drove up to the trailhead with no pack and no equipment. I sat in the parking lot for about an hour. I did not walk onto the trail. I drove home. I am not sure what I had planned to do. On October 25th, in the late afternoon, I received a phone call from BB. said that the maintenance crew was scheduled to do their pre-winter sweep along the ridge above Shelter 2 later that week, and that they had asked whether I had noticed any issues with the marker placement during my patrol. I told B that I had counted 18 markers. There was a pause on the other end of the line. B said, "There are 17. I said, "I counted 18, 3 times. B was quiet for a moment. B said, "Could be a new one. I'll have them check the maintenance log." I said that would be good. B called me back 2 hours later. B said that the maintenance log did not show any new marker added to that section of trail in the past 4 years. B said that the crew would verify the count on their sweep. I thanked B and hung up. The maintenance crew did their sweep on October 28th. They reported 17 markers between the boulder and the spruces. They reported all blazes in normal condition. They did not report any anomalies. I have thought about this many times. I counted 18 markers 3 times on October 16th. The crew counted 17 markers on October 28th. I do not know how to reconcile those two facts. I have considered the possibility that I miscounted. I do not believe that I miscounted 3 times in a row. I have considered the possibility that the crew miscounted. The crew does not typically miscount. I have considered the possibility that a marker was placed and then removed during the intervening 12 days. The maintenance log shows no record of any such placement or removal. I do not have a resolution for this. I am simply recording it. I want to describe one more event, and then I want to describe my decision not to return to the Cranberry sector. On the night of November 2nd, 12 days after I had returned from the patrol, I was at home. I live alone in a small house at the edge of the town nearest the Cranberry station. The house is approximately 18 miles from the trailhead where I had ended my patrol. The house is in town. There are streetlights outside. There are neighbors within 50 yards on either side. At approximately 1:30 a.m., I was awakened by the sound of a single knock. It was a sharp, clear knock, as if struck on wood. I sat up in bed. I listened. I heard nothing else. The knock had not come from the front door, or the back door, or any door I could identify. It had come, as best I could tell, from somewhere very close to my bedroom window. I got up. I went to the window. I parted the curtain. There was nothing outside. The yard was empty. The street light at the end of the block was on. The 2 cars in my neighbor's driveway were where they always were. The night was still. I watched the yard for several minutes. Nothing moved. I went back to bed. I lay there for a long time before I went back to sleep. I want to record that I considered, during that time, the possibility that the knock had been a dream. I considered the possibility that it had been an animal striking the side of the house, perhaps a deer that had wandered into the yard. I considered the possibility that one of the neighbors had dropped something heavy and that the sound had reached me through a wall. I am still considering those possibilities. The knock did not recur. I have not heard another knock at the house in the months since. I want to record the decision I made the next morning, on November 3rd. I called the district office. I asked to be reassigned. I did not give a detailed reason. I said that I needed a change of sector for personal reasons. The district supervisor was understanding. There was an opening in a different sector, more than 200 miles from the Cranberry Wilderness, on a different ridge system. I accepted the reassignment. I started in the new sector on November 17th. I have not been back to the Cranberry sector since October 20th. I have driven past the turnoff to the Trailhead Road on 3 occasions. I have not driven down it. I do not intend to drive down it. I want to record that I am not afraid, in any conscious way, of the Cranberry sector. I have walked those trails for 9 years. I know them. I have eaten lunch on the boulder at the south end of the ridge above Shelter 2 many times. I have slept in Shelter 1 and Shelter 2 and Shelter 3 on more nights than I can count. The sector is, in every measurable way, a place I know. I do not want to go back. The decision not to go back is not a fear exactly. It is closer to a recognition. I am not sure what I recognized. I am not sure I want to know. I will end this account with the observations I have not yet recorded, because they seem to belong somewhere, and because my supervisor asked me to be complete. I have continued to keep my field notebooks in my new sector. The notebooks are normal notebooks. The entries are normal entries. I have not had any further experiences of the kind I have described. I have walked many miles of trail in the new sector and have heard no voices, seen no inexplicable motion, and lost no time that I have been able to detect. I have considered, often, the possibility that what happened to me during the week of October 14th through October 21st was an episode of some specific psychological kind, brought on by fatigue or by isolation or by some combination of factors I cannot identify. I have considered seeking professional evaluation. I have not yet sought it. I keep my notebook from that week in a drawer in my kitchen, separate from the others. I take it out sometimes. I read the entries. The entries are as I have described them. The handwriting is mine. The observations are mine. The underlining I did is still there. I have not added to the notebook and I have not removed anything from it. I want to say that because it is true, and because I want this account to be accurate. I want to record one final observation. I do not know what to do with it. I record it because I think the account would be incomplete without it. On the evening of November 17th, my first day in the new sector, I performed a routine walkthrough of the station and read the operations log for the previous month. The new sector keeps a slightly different log format than the Cranberry sector, but the general structure is the same. I read through the entries from the previous rangers' shifts. I read them carefully, partly because I wanted to familiarize myself with the patterns of the sector, and partly because it is my habit to read carefully. On the entry for October 19th, in a section reserved for radio traffic notes, there was a brief notation. The notation was not made by the previous ranger. The notation was made in a different hand. The notation read, in full, brief contact, west repeater, frequency unclear, voice unfamiliar. Logged for record. The new sector is, as I have mentioned, more than 200 miles from the Cranberry sector. There is no operational relationship between the two stations. The radio repeater serving the new sector is on a different mountain in a different system. The notation does not refer to any transmission I am aware of. The notation is not signed. I want to be careful. I am not claiming that the notation is connected to anything I have described in this account. I am not claiming that the notation is anything other than a routine logbook entry made by some clerk for some reason that has nothing to do with me. I have asked gently whether anyone at the new station knows what the notation refers to. Nobody has been able to tell me. I have copied the notation into my private notebook. I check the notebook sometimes to make sure that the notation is still there in my own handwriting, exactly as I copied it. So far it has been. I do not know how to end this account. I have been told that I should record what I think happened. I do not know what I think happened. I have written down the events as they occurred, in the order they occurred, with the observations I made at the time and the observations I have made since. I have not added a conclusion to the events because I do not have one to add. There is one thing I will say, and then I will sign this account and submit it. I do not believe that the woods are haunted. I do not believe in ghosts. I do not believe in cryptids or demons or any of the things that people sometimes describe when they have spent too long alone in remote places. I have not, in 17 years of backcountry work, seen anything that I would describe as supernatural. I do not believe that I saw anything supernatural during the week of October 14th through October 21st. I do believe, after thinking about it for several months, that there are places in the world where the ordinary properties of perception become less reliable than we are accustomed to. I believe that the Cranberry Wilderness, or some part of it, or possibly only some part of it during some specific week of some specific year, may be such a place. I do not know what makes a place become such a place. I do not know what happens to a person in such a place. I do not know whether I left such a place when I drove out of the trailhead on October 20th, or whether I am still in some way I do not understand partially inside it. I do not intend to go back. I have submitted my request for permanent reassignment. I have not heard the knock at my house again. I have not heard the voice on the slope again. I have not seen the bent trail again, or the 18th marker, or the missing stone at the creek crossing. I check my watch often. I check it more often than I used to. The time on my watch agrees with the time on every other clock I look at. I have no specific reason to expect it not to agree. I check anyway. I do not know when I will stop checking. I am signing this account as a personal narrative submitted in lieu of a formal incident report. I am aware that this account is not, by any official standard, a complete or actionable document. I am submitting it because I was asked to. I am keeping a copy in the drawer with my notebook. My name is Eli Sonuke. I am 41 years old and I have worked as a backcountry ranger in the Cherokee National Forest for 16 years, most of that time inside the Citico Creek Wilderness on the Tennessee side of the Unicoi Range. I write this down because I was asked to and because the report I filed at the time was incomplete. The shift in question began on the 4th of October and lasted, according to my watch and my log, 6 days. I am still not certain that is correct. I want to make something clear from the start. I am not a man inclined towards strange interpretations. My father was a forester and my mother kept the kind of garden that meant we ate from it 9 months of the year, and I was raised to believe that nearly anything you encounter in the woods has a plain explanation if you take the time to find it. Bear, weather, wind, fatigue, old logging cuts that make echoes lie. Ridges that fold sound in a way that confuses anyone who has not walked them. I have always told new rangers that the woods are honest, they reward patience, they do not deceive. I still believe that. I want to say so at the beginning because what follows may suggest otherwise, and I do not want any reader to think I have abandoned the principle. The assignment was routine. A trail maintenance check along the upper portions of the Fodder Stack Trail, with a side patrol into the drainage of South Fork Sitico Creek where 2 thru-hikers had reported a fallen yellow poplar across the path 2 weeks earlier. I was to clear what I could, mark what I could not, and conduct a wildlife observation log along the way. The district office wanted a count of bear sign in advance of the late season closures, standard work for a man like me, in a section of forest I had walked through perhaps 200 times in my career. I left the trailhead at the end of Forest Road 35-1 at 7:42 a.m. on the morning of the 4th. My pack weighed 46 pounds. I carried a Motorola HT-1000 radio on channel 3, a Garmin handheld GPS, a Silva compass clipped to my chest strap, a field notebook in a waterproof sleeve, a folding crosscut saw, a small Pulaski, and 3 days of food and water, with a filter for resupply at the creek. My boots were broken in. The weather was clear and cold, 43 degrees at the trailhead, with a forecast calling for fog along the higher ridges by evening and a chance of rain on the 6th. I logged my departure with dispatch at 7:44 a.m. and received a check-in window for 1 p.m. The first 3 miles of trail are familiar to me in a way that goes beyond memory. I know the place where the trail bends around a beach with a scar on its north side. The place where a stone the size of a coffee table has been working its way out of the embankment for years. The place where a small spring flushes the trail to mud for about 20 yards every fall. All of these were where they should have been. I made my way at a steady pace, noted 3 sets of bear scat at varying ages, observed a barred owl roosting at unusual height for the time of day, and reached the first switchback above South Fork by 9:50 a.m. I logged the time. The mountains were quiet in the ordinary way they are quiet on cold mornings, which is to say they were not quiet at all, but full of small movement. Dripping, settling, the small clicks of squirrels working through the leaf litter. I sat on a rock and drank some water and ate a piece of jerky, and then I started up. The fallen poplar was where the hikers had described, at roughly the 4-mile mark, lying across the trail at a shallow angle and tangled with 2 smaller hemlocks that had come down with it. It was a substantial tree, perhaps 30 inches in diameter at the base, and I recognized at once that it was beyond what I could clear with a handsaw. I logged the position at 11:18 a.m., photographed it with the camera I carry, and marked it for the trail crew. I then began the work of cutting a passable bypass around the root ball, which sat on a small bench above the trail. This took me until 12:30 p.m. I ate lunch sitting on the trunk of the poplar with my feet against the upturned root mass. From that position I could see down into the drainage of South Fork Sitico Creek, where the rhododendron thickets begin in earnest. The wilderness designation here is recent, the forest old. Some of the hemlocks in the bottom were dead from adelgad, gray and bare-limbed, standing among the still-living oaks and birches. The creek was loud below me, a constant white noise of water over rock. At 1 p.m. I performed my radio check with dispatch. I called twice. The first attempt produced only static, the second connected, and the dispatcher, a woman named Renee whom I have worked with for 11 years, confirmed my position and weather and asked me to repeat my next check-in time. I told her 5 p.m. She acknowledged. The transmission was clear, though I noted afterward in my log that the static on the first attempt had been unusual for that elevation and that line of sight. I have a fairly reliable mental map of where radio works and where it does not in Sitico, and the bench above the poplar is in a good spot. I noted the static and moved on. I continued down the trail into the drainage. The grade steepened, and the trail at points was reduced to a narrow channel cut into the side of the ridge, with rhododendron arching overhead. There is a particular quality to walking through a rhododendron tunnel in late afternoon. The light becomes greenish and dim. Sound becomes flat and close. You can hear your own breath and the creak of your pack, but the larger sounds of the forest seem to come from very far away, as though heard through cloth. It was inside one of these tunnels, at approximately 2:14 p.m., that I heard the first thing I could not explain. It was a single dry knock, The sound of one piece of wood struck firmly against another. Not loud, not close. It came from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, or perhaps slightly to the left, downslope. I stopped and waited. After perhaps 30 seconds, I heard it again. The same knock, the same volume, the same character. It did not repeat in the irregular way that branches knock against one another in wind, and there was no wind to speak of inside the tunnel. I considered the possibilities. A hiker ahead of me, working with a trekking pole against a tree. A piece of woodpecker work, though it did not sound like a woodpecker. A branch falling and striking another branch on the way down, though such sounds usually come in a cascade and are not so cleanly singular. I waited for a third knock to confirm or rule out any of these. It did not come. I continued down the trail. I made a note in my book, 2:14 p.m., single knock, repeated once, source unclear. This was a habit. I make notes on small anomalies because over the years they sometimes add up to a useful pattern. A man with my job learns to write things down. I emerged from the rhododendron tunnel at 2:32 p.m. into a small flat where the trail crosses an old skid road. I checked my map. The skid road was not on the map. This did not concern me. There are many such roads in the older parts of Sitico, left over from the chestnut and tanbark cuts of the early 20th century, and the maps do not show all of them. I noted the crossing in my book and continued down the trail toward the creek. I made camp that first night at a site I knew well, a flat shelf of ground perhaps 200 yards above South Fork, set back from the trail in a stand of mature tulip poplar. The site is unofficial but established, with a fire ring of stones that has been there longer than I have been in the district. I have stayed there perhaps a dozen times. I pitched my tarp, hung my food bag in the usual tree, filled my filter bottles at the creek, and built a small fire in the existing ring. I logged my position at 4:48 p.m. At 5 p.m. I performed my radio check with dispatch. The signal was poor but adequate. Renee logged my check-in and confirmed a 7 a.m. check the following morning. The fog began to come up out of the drainage at dusk. This is normal for Sitico in October. The cold air pools in the bottoms and the moisture rising off the creek meets it and forms a low ceiling that creeps uphill as the night cools. By 6:30 p.m. the fog had reached my camp. I could see no further than 30 feet in any direction. The light dropped quickly after that, and I sat by my fire and ate my supper and listened to the woods. I want to describe what I heard, because it is the first observation I made that I cannot place in any familiar category. The creek was loud as it had been all day. From my camp I could hear it as a continuous, layered sound, the higher tones of water over rock and the deeper note of larger pools. This sound did not change. Over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, between 6:50 p.m. and 7:10 p.m., while I sat and watched my fire, I noticed that everything else in the forest had become quiet. There were no insects, which was not unusual for the temperature. There were no birds settling, which would have been ordinary in evening. There was no movement in the leaf litter, no squirrel sound, no small click of branches in the canopy. The only sound was the creek. I sat very still and listened. I have spent enough time in these woods to know what their silences sound like. A bear moving nearby will silence the small animals in a wide ring. A predator passing through will do the same. Even certain weather patterns when a barometric drop is coming will produce a hush. I have noticed all of these in my career and they have particular qualities. The silence I noticed that night was different. It was complete. It did not have the texture of waiting. It was simply an absence. It lasted, by my watch, 23 minutes. I did not move during this time. I watched my fire and listened. At 7:13 p.m. the small sounds returned. They came back not gradually but all at once. A squirrel began to chatter somewhere behind me. A branch creaked. The leaf litter at the edge of my camp ticked with the small movement of something, probably a vole. I noted the time and wrote a brief description in my book. I considered whether to mention it in my report. I decided I would not. The silence of a forest is not a reportable event. It would only invite questions I could not answer. I went to my tarp at 8:30 p.m. I slept well, or believed that I did. I was awakened once, at a time I did not record because I was too tired to find my watch, by what I thought was the sound of someone walking past my camp on the trail above. The footsteps were unhurried. They had the rhythm of a deliberate pace, not the irregular stepping of an animal. I lay still and listened. The footsteps continued for perhaps 15 seconds and then stopped. I waited. They did not resume. After several minutes, I closed my eyes and went back to sleep. In the morning, when it was light, I walked up to the trail. The ground was damp from the fog, and I could see clearly where my own boots had pressed into the soft places the day before. There were no other prints. I walked perhaps 100 yards in each direction from my campsite. The trail was unmarked. I wrote in my book, "Footsteps heard during the night, no prints." I underlined the word no. The second day I continued my patrol up the South Fork drainage to the confluence with a smaller tributary that local maps call Cold Spring Branch. The trail in this section is irregular, washed out in places by years of unmaintained runoff, and I had to pick my way around several blowdowns that were too small to mark but too large to ignore. I made slow progress. I logged my position frequently because the GPS was reliable and because the irregularity of the terrain made distance estimation difficult. At 10:47 a.m. I came upon a section of trail that I did not remember. This is not a strong claim. I have walked this section perhaps a dozen times over many years, and the woods change. Trees fall, banks erode, new growth comes in along old cuts. But the section I am describing was not consistent with my memory in a way that I want to record precisely. The trail there passes along the upper edge of a small bench above the creek, and at one point it bends sharply around a large yellow birch. I have a clear memory of this birch because some years ago I cleared a deadfall against its base, and the trunk has a small painted blaze at chest height from that work. I came around the bend on the second day, and the birch was not there. The trail continued, and the bench was the same, and the creek below was the same, but the tree was not in the place I remembered it. I stopped. I checked my GPS. The position was correct. I was where I should have been. I looked along the trail for the painted blaze. I found it, eventually, on a different tree, perhaps 40 feet further along the trail than I expected. It was the same blaze, the same paint, the same height. I had made it myself perhaps 4 years earlier. I considered the possibilities. My memory of the location was wrong. This was the simplest explanation. A man who has walked a trail a dozen times over many years will inevitably misremember small details, and a tree that I had clearly remembered as being at one point in the trail might in fact have always been 40 feet further on. This is what I told myself. I wrote the observation in my notebook. I did not underline anything. I continued. At 12:18 p.m. I reached the confluence with Cold Spring Branch and stopped for lunch. I drank water from my filter bottle and ate the second of 3 sandwiches I had brought. The sun was overhead and the day had warmed considerably. The drainage was loud with the 2 streams meeting, and there was a small wind moving the high tops of the canopy. I sat on a rock and ate and listened to the woods. It was while I was sitting there, at perhaps 12:30 p.m., that I heard the voice. I want to describe it carefully. It was not loud. It came from upslope somewhere above me and to the southeast, perhaps 200 yards distant. It was not a shout. It was the sound of a voice in ordinary conversation. The kind of sound you might hear from a campsite some distance away when 2 people are speaking to one another at a normal volume. I could not make out words. I could not determine whether the voice belonged to a man or a woman. I could only identify it as a voice. I waited and listened. The voice did not repeat. I considered the possibility of hikers. There are no established trails on that slope. The terrain is steep and choked with rhododendron and laurel. It would be unusual for a hiker to be there, but not impossible. I considered the possibility of a hunter, though it was not yet hunting season for the species I would expect to find in that elevation. I considered the possibility that I had misidentified some other sound, a bird call at the edge of range, a creak of 2 branches rubbing. The brain is good at finding voices where there are none. I called out. I shouted hello at full volume and waited for a response. There was none. I shouted again. There was none. I performed my 1 p.m. radio check at the confluence and the signal was poor, but I made contact. I did not mention the voice. I had a decision to make. The terrain to the southeast was difficult and steep, and to investigate would mean leaving the trail and bushwhacking up a slope that was almost certainly not crossable in less than 2 hours. I had 3 more miles of patrol to complete that day if I was to maintain my planned schedule. I weighed the possibility of a hiker in distress against the possibility of fatigue or auditory error. I made the decision to continue the patrol and to note the observation for the report. I continued. The third day I broke camp at first light and worked my way up the western fork of the drainage toward the high ridge where Fodderstack Trail rejoins the main ridgeline. The grade is unforgiving. I made perhaps a mile and a half by noon. The weather was changing. The forecast had called for clear skies into the 6th with rain possible after, but the sky that morning was a uniform gray and the wind had a damp edge to it. I considered the possibility that the forecast was wrong. This happens. The Smokies and Unaquois generate their own weather, and the National Weather Service is sometimes caught by it. I conducted my 7 a.m. radio check from the bench above my camp before I broke. The signal was poor. I had to repeat myself twice for Renee to confirm my position. She told me a low-pressure system was moving in from the west earlier than expected and asked whether I wanted to revise my plan. I told her I would assess from the ridge at noon. She acknowledged. At 11:46 a.m. I reached an elevation of approximately 3,800 feet, on the ridgeline near the saddle that overlooks the head of South Fork. I sat on a fallen log and ate a piece of bread and a hard-boiled egg and looked out at the country I had come up through. The fog was thick in the bottoms, but the ridge was clear. I could see, far down the drainage, the bright color of the maples that had turned early. I could see the rocky outcroppings on the ridges across the valley. I could see, perhaps 3 miles distant, a small column of smoke. This concerned me. There was no permitted camping in that section. There were no roads in. The terrain was such that a hunter or hiker who had built a fire there would have done so in violation of the wilderness rules and at considerable difficulty to themselves. I watched the smoke for perhaps 10 minutes. It was thin and steady and white, the kind of smoke that comes from a small managed fire of dry wood, not the dark plume of a wildfire or the irregular puff of something burning poorly. It rose in a straight line through the still air above the fog. I marked the location on my map as precisely as I could. I performed my noon radio check. The signal was acceptable on the ridge. I reported the smoke. Renee told me there were no permits issued for that area and no known parties operating in the wilderness on the western side. She asked whether I could investigate. I told her I would consider it after my afternoon work and provide an update at the 5 p.m. check. She acknowledged. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said something that I did not quite hear, and the static came up over her voice. I asked her to repeat. The static cleared and she said the call had broken up and asked whether I had repeated my position. I did not understand. I asked her what she had said. She told me she had said only the acknowledgement and the request for the position repeat. I told her there had been something else in the transmission. She said she had not transmitted anything else. I asked her to repeat my last reported position back to me. She did. It was correct. I closed the transmission and made a note in my log. I had heard, between her acknowledgement and her request for a position repeat, a voice say what sounded like the syllables, "Still here." It had been quiet and underneath the static, and I had taken it for a moment to be Renee's voice, but it had not been her voice. I had not been certain enough at the moment of transmission to question it, and I had assumed I had misheard her. I sat on the log for several minutes. I considered going down to investigate the smoke. The terrain between my position and the smoke was severe, perhaps 1.5 miles of bushwhacking through laurel hells across 2 intermediate ridges, and I would not be able to make the round trip before dark. I considered camping where I was on the ridge and descending in the morning. The ridge was exposed and the weather was deteriorating. I decided to continue my planned patrol along Fodder Stack Trail and to make camp at the next reliable water source, then revisit the smoke question in the morning. By 1:30 p.m. the ridge had fogged in completely. I could not see the smoke. I could not see the opposite ridges. I could see perhaps 50 feet of trail in front of me. I walked carefully, watching for the small cairns that mark the route in this section, and kept my GPS in my hand. The afternoon of the 3rd day produced 2 observations that I will record together because they are connected. The first was a question of distance. At approximately 2:45 p.m., on a section of Fodder Stack Trail that runs along the contour at roughly 3,700 feet, I stopped to drink water. The fog was dense. I could see perhaps 30 feet. The wind had increased and the temperature had dropped. I estimated my position by GPS as 2.6 miles from the trail junction where I had eaten lunch. The GPS read 4:14 p.m. trail time, which is to say, the time since I had begun walking from that junction. I had been walking, by my watch, for 2 hours and 15 minutes. At my normal pace on that grade I should have covered approximately 1.8 miles, not 2.6. I checked my watch against the GPS clock. They agreed. I checked the GPS position again. It was consistent. I considered the possibility that the GPS was malfunctioning. I considered the possibility that I had walked faster than I realized. The grade had not been favorable for fast walking. I considered the possibility that the trail was shorter than my map indicated, that the contour was not a true contour and was in fact descending more than the map showed. This last seemed most likely. I noted the discrepancy in my book. 2:45 p.m. GPS position 2.6 miles from last waypoint. Elapsed walking time 2 hours 15 minutes. Faster than expected. I continued. The second observation came at 3:22 p.m. I had reached a point on the trail where it bends through a small grove of mountain laurel and emerges onto a rocky outcropping. There is a signpost at this outcropping, a simple wooden sign with the name of the section and a distance to the next trail junction. The sign was where I expected it to be. I stopped to read it. The distance posted on the sign was 1.4 miles to the next junction. I checked my map. The map showed 1.9 miles between the outcropping and the next junction. This is the kind of inconsistency that occurs in older trail signs. The map is updated less frequently than the signs are repainted, or the signs are repainted by volunteers who do not have access to the most recent surveys. It is not unusual. I made a note in my book. I logged the GPS position so that the trail crew could check the distance on a future patrol. What I want to note is what happened next. I continued from the outcropping along the trail. By my watch, I walked for 35 minutes at a steady pace. I came around a bend and emerged from a stand of red spruce and found myself at the trail junction that the sign had referenced. The sign at the junction confirmed the location. I checked my GPS. The position was correct. I had walked by GPS 1.9 miles from the outcropping. The sign at the outcropping had said 1.4. I had walked, in any case, for 35 minutes, which at my pace on that terrain was consistent with neither figure. I sat on a rock at the junction and drank water and tried to work this out. The discrepancy on the sign could be explained. The discrepancy in my walking time could not. I had been walking faster than I realized in the prior section, and slower in this one, and the GPS had been consistent throughout. The numbers did not work in any combination that produced a sensible result. I considered the possibility that I had stopped without realizing it. This sometimes happens when one is tired, particularly in fog, when the brain fills in time that has not in fact passed. But I had not been particularly tired, and the fog had been no worse than earlier in the day. I performed my 5 p.m. radio check from the junction. The signal was poor. I had to repeat myself 4 times for Renee to confirm. She did not mention the smoke. I asked about it. She told me she had no record of a smoke report from me. I told her I had reported it at noon. She said she had received my noon check but no smoke report. I told her I had reported it clearly. She said she would check the logs. I asked her to confirm my position. She gave me a position that was perhaps a mile from where I was. I did not correct her. I told her I would check in at 7 a.m. the next morning and close the transmission. I made camp that night at the trail junction, in a flat spot I had used once before. I did not build a fire. I do not remember why I made that decision at the time. I think now it was because I did not want to be visible. I slept badly. There was no specific reason. The temperature dropped further during the night, and the fog froze on the laurel leaves, and the wind picked up just enough to move the moisture off in a steady fall that sounded like rain. I lay under my tarp and listened to it. At 2:14 a.m., according to my watch, I heard the knock again. It was the same single dry knock I had heard on the first day in the rhododendron tunnel. It came from somewhere upslope, perhaps 100 yards out, in the direction of the spruce grove. It was the same volume and the same character. I waited. After perhaps 30 seconds it repeated, and then again, this time 3 knocks in a series, evenly spaced. Then silence. I lay still. I did not get out of my bag. I did not turn on my headlamp. I listened. After perhaps 5 minutes I heard footsteps. They were walking on the trail itself, not on the soft ground beside it. The rhythm was deliberate and unhurried. They were coming from the direction of the spruce grove, moving along the trail toward the junction where I had camped. I could not see anything because the fog was opaque and my tarp was angled away from the trail and the night was very dark. I could only hear. The footsteps reached a point approximately 15 feet from my tarp and stopped. I did not move. I held my breath as long as I could. When I had to breathe, I let the air out very slowly through my mouth and drew it back in even more slowly. I have done this on bear watches and on the rare occasions when I have surprised a wild boar at close range. The animal does not know you are there as long as you do not move and do not breathe in a way it can hear. The footsteps did not resume. There was no other sound. I waited for what felt like a long time but which my watch later told me was approximately 7 minutes. Then I heard something I want to describe carefully. I heard breathing. It was not loud. It was not close. It came from the direction the footsteps had stopped in, approximately 15 feet away, on the trail. It was the sound of slow, deep breathing, the kind a person makes who is at rest or who has just stopped walking and is recovering. It was not labored. It was not the snorting breath of a bear or the chuffing of a boar. It was a human pattern of breathing, in and out at the rhythm of an adult at rest. It continued for perhaps 2 minutes, then it stopped, and the footsteps resumed, walking away from me, back in the direction of the spruce grove. They faded slowly. The grove was not close. The footsteps were audible for longer than any footsteps should have been on that kind of ground. I lay in my tarp until dawn. I did not sleep again. When the light came up at 6:50 a.m., I waited another 20 minutes before I emerged. I went to the trail and looked at the ground. The frost from the fog had dusted the trail evenly. There were no prints anywhere. My own prints from the previous evening were visible where I had walked to the edge of the camp. No other prints disturbed the frost. I sat on a rock at the junction for perhaps an hour. I made a careful entry in my notebook describing everything I had heard, with the times as best I could remember them. I noted the absence of prints. I did not underline anything. I considered whether to call the incident into dispatch. I decided I would not. There was nothing to report. A man cannot file an incident report for sounds. He cannot ask dispatch to send help because he heard breathing. I performed my 7 a.m. check. The signal was poor. I made contact. I gave my position and told Renee I was beginning my return patrol back down the western side. She acknowledged. I did not mention the night. I broke camp at 8:15 a.m. and started down. I had intended, on the return, to descend by way of the western flank of the ridge, along a less traveled spur that joins Fodderstack to a maintenance road at a lower elevation, with the goal of completing my patrol by mid-afternoon on the 5th day and reaching the trailhead by evening. I made this plan because the weather was continuing to deteriorate and because I wanted to be off the high ridge before any rain arrived. The descent began ordinarily. The spur is well marked for the first half mile and then becomes faint, traceable but not maintained, with old blazes on the trees that have not been repainted in many years. I had walked it once before, in the previous fall, as part of a similar patrol. I had a general memory of the route. At 10:30 a.m., by my watch, I noticed that the light around me had changed. It is difficult to describe this precisely. The sky had remained gray since before dawn and there was no sun visible. The light filtering down through the canopy had been even and dim all morning, the kind of light that does not change much through the middle of the day in autumn. At 10:30 a.m. I became aware that the light was slightly different. It was not darker exactly. It was flatter. It had no direction. I could not have pointed to where the sun was. I tried, and I could not. I stopped and checked my compass. The needle was steady, pointing north as expected. I checked my GPS. The position was consistent with where I expected to be on the spur, approximately 1 mile below the ridge. The time on the GPS was 10:31 a.m. I held my watch up next to the GPS screen. My watch read 11:47 a.m. I want to be precise about this because I have considered the possibility many times since. My watch is a Casio that I have worn for 9 years. It does not lose time. The GPS draws its clock from satellite signal and is also reliable. They had agreed at every check throughout the trip. At that moment they disagreed by 1 hour and 16 minutes. I sat down on a fallen log and looked at them. I held them side by side. The GPS time advanced minute by minute. My watch advanced minute by minute. The difference remained constant. They were not running at different speeds. They were simply showing different times. I had no explanation. I considered the possibility that I had bumped my watch and changed the time without noticing, that I had set it wrong somehow during the morning, that I had been confused at some prior check. None of these were consistent with my memory of the morning. I had checked the watch against the GPS at the 7 a.m. radio check. They had agreed. I removed my watch and held it up to my ear. It was ticking. I shook it. The hands did not move. I put it back on my wrist. I considered the practical question of which to trust for the remainder of the day. The GPS was more reliable in principle. I made the decision to use the GPS time as my reference and to note the discrepancy in my report. I continued down the spur. The trail became fainter. I lost the blazes once and had to backtrack for 15 minutes to pick them up again. I came to a small stream crossing that I did not remember. I checked my map. The map did not show a stream there. I checked my GPS. The position was where I expected to be. I crossed the stream and continued. At 12:14 p.m. by the GPS, which was 1:30 p.m. by my watch, I performed an unscheduled radio check. I felt the need for contact. The signal was poor. I tried 3 times. The third attempt produced a response, but the response was unintelligible. The voice on the other end was not Renee. It was a man's voice. I could not make out the words. I asked the voice to identify. The voice spoke again, garbled, and the static came up. I repeated my call. There was no response. I waited 5 minutes and tried again. The signal was poor. I made contact. Renee answered. She sounded tired. I asked whether anyone else had been on the channel in the last 10 minutes. She said no. I asked whether the channel had been used by anyone in the district that morning. She checked. She said no. I gave my position and told her I expected to reach the maintenance road by 4 p.m. She acknowledged. She asked whether I was all right. I told her I was. She did not press. I closed the transmission. I want to describe the afternoon of the 5th day separately because it is the section of the trip that I have most trouble accounting for. I have written this part out several times in the years since, and each version differs in small ways from the others. I will try to write what I remember now, with the understanding that some of what I am about to put down may not have happened in exactly this order. The spur trail descends through a series of switchbacks along the western flank of the ridge before flattening out in a long bench of mixed hardwood at about 2,800 feet. I reached the bench at approximately 1:40 p.m. by the GPS. The fog had lifted somewhat by then, and the visibility had improved to perhaps 200 yards. The forest in the bench is open, the trees old, with little understory. It was on this bench that the woods became silent. I have already described the silence of the first night and what I understood about its character. The silence on the bench was the same kind of silence but more pronounced. I noticed it first as an absence of bird sound. There had been birds in the morning. There were no birds now. I stopped walking and listened. There was no wind. The fog had eaten the wind. There was no insect sound, which would have been ordinary for the temperature, but there was also no movement in the leaf litter. There was no creak of branches. There was no sound of water. The stream I had crossed was perhaps half a mile behind me, but on a still day I should have heard it as a distant murmur. I did not hear it. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the small sounds of my own pack settling on my back. I could hear the click of the metal on my chest strap when I moved. I could hear nothing else. I held still and listened for perhaps a minute. The silence did not change. I tried clapping my hands once, sharply. The sound was muted. The clap did not echo. It did not carry. It seemed to die in the air a few feet from my body. This is the part I have written several different ways in different drafts. The truth is I do not know how long I stood there. The GPS, when I looked at it, told me I had been on the bench for 40 minutes. I had walked perhaps 50 yards. I had no memory of the time passing. I want to say I was frightened. I was not frightened in the way one is frightened by a bear or by a fall. I was frightened in a way I have only ever been frightened by certain kinds of weather. When a storm is building and the air goes still in a particular way before it breaks. It was an attentive fear. It was the fear of a man who knows something is wrong but cannot determine what. I began walking again. I walked deliberately, not quickly. I watched my GPS. I walked for what the GPS told me was 35 minutes. In that time I covered, by the GPS, 400 yards. This is approximately 1/4 the pace I should have been walking on flat ground. I do not remember the walking. I remember starting and I remember finishing. I do not remember the trees I passed. At the end of the bench, the trail begins to descend again toward the maintenance road. And as I began the descent, the sound returned. It came back all at once, exactly as it had on the first night. The wind moved in the canopy. A jay called somewhere distant. The forest had texture again. I sat down on a stump and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They had not been shaking that I had noticed while I was on the bench. They were shaking now. I performed an unscheduled radio check. I told Renee I was descending toward the maintenance road and expected to reach it within 2 hours. She acknowledged. She asked whether I was all right. I told her I was tired. She accepted this. She did not press. I closed the transmission and continued down. I reached the maintenance road at 4:48 p.m. by the GPS. The road is a single-lane dirt track gated at the lower end and used by the Forest Service for access to a small communications hut on a side ridge. From the gate, it is approximately 3 miles to where I had left my truck. I sat on a rock by the gate and ate the last of my food and drank water and thought about what to do. It was getting dark. The fog had begun to come back up out of the lower drainages. The forecast rain had not yet arrived, but the air was wet. If I started down the road immediately, I would reach my truck shortly after sunset, walking the last mile in darkness. This was not difficult. The road was easy walking and I had a headlamp. The alternative was to camp by the gate, which was permitted, and to descend in the morning. I made the decision to walk out. I am not certain I made the decision rationally. I think I wanted to be away from the woods. I started down the road at 5:10 p.m. I walked at a steady pace. The road follows the contour of the ridge for perhaps the first mile before beginning a long, gentle descent toward the trailhead. I had walked the road perhaps 100 times. At approximately 5:45 p.m., in the last good light of the day, I came around a bend and saw, perhaps 200 yards down the road, the figure of a man. I want to describe what I saw precisely. The man was standing in the middle of the road. He was facing away from me, toward the descending direction. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, and slim. He appeared to be wearing dark clothing, possibly a dark jacket and dark pants. I could not see his head clearly because of the angle and the fading light. He was not moving. I stopped. I called out hello. He did not move. I called again. He did not move. I considered the possibilities. A hiker who had become disoriented. A hunter, though this was not the right area for it. A maintenance worker, though I had not been told of any work scheduled on the road. None of these explanations was consistent with the way the man was standing, motionless, in the middle of the road, facing away. I unclipped my radio and called dispatch. The signal was good on the road. Renee answered immediately. I told her I was on the maintenance road approaching the lower gate and that I could see a man standing in the road perhaps 200 yards down from my position. I asked her whether she had any information about anyone being in that area. She checked. She said there was no one logged in that area. She asked whether the person was in distress. I told her I did not know. I told her the person was not moving. She asked whether I could approach. I told her I would attempt to. I began to walk down the road. I walked slowly. I called out as I walked. Hello, are you all right? Do you need assistance? I am a ranger. The figure did not respond. It did not move. I had closed perhaps 50 yards of the distance when I became aware of something I had not noticed at first. The figure cast no shadow. The light, what was left of it, came from the western sky behind a layer of cloud, weak but directional. The trees on the road cast faint, long shadows in the dimness. The figure did not. I stopped. I called out again. There was no response. I lifted my radio. I told Renee I was reconsidering the approach. She asked why. I did not know how to answer her. I said the situation appeared unsafe. She asked me to clarify. I said I could not. She told me to hold my position. She told me she would dispatch backup from the district office. She told me the response time would be approximately 45 minutes. I told her I would wait. I stood in the road for what I believed was perhaps 30 seconds, watching the figure. The figure did not move. The light was failing. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I did not see it leave. I did not hear footsteps. I had not blinked, that I remember. The road was straight in that section and there was nowhere for the figure to have gone without my seeing the movement. I looked at the verges of the road. The brush was thick. A person could have stepped off the road into the brush, but not silently and not without my seeing the motion. I reported the disappearance to Renee. She acknowledged. She told me to remain in place until the response team arrived. I sat down on the road. I kept my headlamp off. I watched the place where the figure had been. The light failed completely over the next 20 minutes. I sat in the dark and watched and waited. The response team arrived at 7:02 p.m., 2 rangers, both of whom I had worked with for many years, in a Forest Service truck. They saw my headlamp from a quarter mile down the road and called me on the radio as they approached. I confirmed my position. They drove up slowly, with their high beams on, scanning the road and the verges. They reached me and stopped. I got into the truck. I gave a brief account of what I had seen. They were professional. They did not press for details. They asked whether I was injured or ill. I told them I was not. They drove me down the road, scanning with their lights. We saw nothing. They drove me to my truck at the trailhead. I told them I was capable of driving myself out. They asked whether I would prefer one of them to ride with me. I told them I would not. They watched me get into my truck and start it, and then they followed me down the forest road to the main highway, and then they pulled off and let me go. I drove home. I do not remember the drive. I want to describe the report I filed because it is the only formal documentation that exists of the trip, and because it is incomplete. I filed the report on the 7th, 2 days after I came out. I described the patrol in detail. I documented the fallen poplar. I documented the bear sign. I documented the smoke I had seen from the ridge, which the district investigated, and which they could not find any source for on the ground. I documented the unidentified figure on the maintenance road. I described it as a possible hiker who left the road before I could make contact, and I did not mention the absence of a shadow. I did not mention the knock. I did not mention the voice from the slope above Cold Spring Branch. I did not mention the footsteps and the breathing in the night at the trail junction. I did not mention the silence on the bench. I did not mention the discrepancy between my watch and the GPS. I did not mention the voice on the radio that was not Renee. I have wondered, in the years since, why I did not mention these things. I do not believe it was because I disbelieved my own observations. I believed them then and I believe them now. I think it was because I understood instinctively that to include them would change the nature of the report. The report would no longer be a document of a patrol. It would become a document of my own perception and would invite the kind of scrutiny that ends careers. I requested reassignment from the district 2 months later. I cited a desire to be closer to home, which was true, but it was not the whole reason. The district supervisor accepted the request without question. He had been in the service for 30 years and had perhaps seen this sort of thing before in other rangers. He did not press. I have not returned to Citico Creek Wilderness since. I want to add, at the end, several observations that have not fit anywhere else. In the months after the patrol, I went through my notes and my photographs many times. The photographs are unremarkable. There are pictures of the fallen poplar, of the trail signs, of the bench above South Fork, of various points along Fodderstack Trail. None of them show anything unusual. There is no figure in any of them. There are no shapes in the fog. I include this because I want to be clear that I am not basing my account on evidence. I am basing it on my own memory and on the notes I made at the time. My notes from the trip are still in my possession. I have read through them many times. They are consistent with my account. They include the timestamps and the observations I have described. There is one entry I want to mention specifically. On the page for the 5th day, between an entry I made at 12:14 p.m. and an entry I made at 4:48 p.m., there is a single line in my handwriting that I do not remember writing. It says, "Do not look behind you on the bench." I had not been thinking about the bench when I wrote it, that I remember. I do not know when I wrote it. The handwriting is mine. I have considered the possibility that I wrote it after the trip, in a state of confusion and forgot. This is possible. I have considered the possibility that I wrote it during the silence on the bench, in a kind of dissociation, and that this is why I do not remember the walking. This is also possible. I prefer the first explanation, but I cannot rule out the second. I want to mention Renee. She retired 3 years after my patrol. I called her once, perhaps a year after the trip, to ask whether she remembered anything unusual about the transmissions during those days. She was kind. She told me she remembered the trip clearly because she had been worried about me. She told me that on the 3rd night, at approximately 2:30 a.m., she had received a brief unscheduled transmission on Channel 3 from what she believed was my radio. The transmission had been mostly static. She had heard, she said, what she thought was breathing, and then the channel had closed. I told her I had been asleep at 2:30 a.m. I had not transmitted. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she might have been mistaken. She might have heard another patrol. She might have been tired. She did not sound as though she believed any of these explanations. She did not press them. We did not speak of the trip again. I want to mention one last thing. Last autumn, on a cold morning in October, I was walking on a maintained trail in a state park near my home, perhaps 300 miles from Citico. The trail was busy. There were many other hikers. I was not alone at any point. I came around a bend and stopped because I had heard, somewhere ahead of me, a single dry knock. It was not loud. It was not close. It was the sound of one piece of wood struck firmly against another. I waited. After perhaps 30 seconds it repeated. The same volume, the same character. The hikers around me did not seem to hear it. A family with 2 children walked past me without stopping. A man with a dog passed me a moment later. The dog did not react. I stood on the trail for several minutes. The knock did not repeat a 3rd time. I do not know whether it was the same sound I had heard in Citico. There is no way to know such a thing. I make no claim that it was. I record it only because it happened, and because I made a note of it in the notebook I now keep for this purpose, and because the notebook is becoming longer than I would like it to be. I do not know what happened in Citico Creek Wilderness in October of that year. I have considered, at various points, all of the possible explanations. Fatigue, carbon monoxide from a poorly ventilated stove, though I had not used a stove. Some toxin in the water, though my filter was new. A small stroke or other neurological event, though I have been examined and nothing has been found. A psychiatric episode, though I have spoken at length with a professional who has told me my account is consistent with experiences reported by many people in many places and is not in itself evidence of any disorder. I have considered the possibility that I was deceived by my own perception, that the woods that week were no different than they had ever been, and that something in me was different. This is the most comfortable explanation. I have tried to accept it. I have considered the possibility that the woods were different that week, that something was there, in some way, that does not have a name in any vocabulary I know, and that I do not need to give it a name because to name it would be to claim a knowledge I do not have, that something was present and observed me, and was observed by me, and that nothing more can be said about it. I do not know which of these is true. I have stopped expecting to know. I keep my notebooks in a drawer in my desk at home. I open them sometimes. I read what I wrote on the bench in the dark of the trail junction. I read the entry I do not remember writing. I look at the timestamps. They are very precise. The man who wrote them was, I believe, telling the truth. The maintenance road, the last I heard, is still gated and still passable. The communications hut on the side ridge has been replaced with a newer model. Fodder Stack Trail is maintained. Hikers go up there every season. They come back. Most of them come back. I have a place now, several states away, where the land is flat and the trees are not very tall. I walk in the mornings before the sun comes up. I do not walk after dark. I do not walk in fog. Sometimes, on still mornings, when the air is heavy and the small sounds of the world have dropped away for a moment in the way that small sounds will, I find myself waiting. I am waiting to hear whether the silence will end on its own, or whether it will hold longer than it should, or whether something inside it will move. It has not held, yet. The small sounds have always come back. I am still listening. My name is Wesley Holcomb. I am 41 years old and have worked as a backcountry ranger in Pisgah National Forest for 17 years. Before that, I spent 4 seasons on a hotshot crew out of Asheville and 2 summers as a trail maintenance lead under the Carolina Mountain Club. I have a Wilderness First Responder certification, a Class B commercial driver's license, and the kind of knees that tell me when a low-pressure system is coming in 2 days before the weather radio does. I write this report on my own time, on my own paper, 3 months after the events I am about to describe. The official incident log filed under my name on October 14 contains the standard entries: patrol completed, weather observations, equipment status, no contacts. The log is technically accurate. It is also incomplete. I have decided to keep this longer account because I have not been able to stop thinking about that week, and because I want a record that exists outside the official system in case my memory continues to deteriorate. The assignment was routine. The Burnt Mountain sector is a quiet pocket of the Pisgah district that includes about 9 miles of old logging grade, a feeder section of the Art Loeb Trail, 2 unmarked spur trails maintained informally, and a small patrol cabin near the headwaters of Possum Branch. The cabin was built in 1953, rebuilt in 1981, and has not been used as a permanent station since the late 90s. We keep it stocked for overnight patrols and emergency shelter. It has a wood stove, a small propane stove, a bunk, a metal desk, a paper log, and a hand crank radio. There is no cell signal. There is no electricity. The roof leaks in 2 places that I have personally patched 4 times. The purpose of my patrol was simple. A hiker had reported a downed tree across the Possum Branch spur and possible evidence of an unauthorized fire ring. I was scheduled for 4 nights at the cabin to clear the tree, document the fire ring, perform a general condition survey of the cabin, and conduct routine patrols of the surrounding ridges. Standard work. I have done dozens of patrols like it. I left the Brevard office at 5:42 a.m. on October 8. I logged my departure with dispatch. My truck was loaded with a chainsaw, fuel mix, hand tools, 4 days of food, my standard pack, a paper topo, a backup GPS, 2 radios, and the cabin resupply box. The weather forecast called for partly cloudy conditions, overnight lows around 46 degrees, and a small chance of rain on the 3rd day. I noted all of this in my field notebook on the page dated October 8. The notebook is in front of me as I write. The entries from the first day are calm and professional. The entries from the 3rd and 4th days are not as steady. The handwriting in the later entries is mine, but it changes character. I want to be clear about that. The handwriting is mine. I parked at the gated Forest Service road at 7:08 a.m. and continued in on foot. The walk to the cabin is roughly 3.5 miles along an old logging grade that climbs gradually through mixed hardwood and rhododendron. Conditions were cool and damp. Fog was lying in the lower drainages but breaking up on the ridges. I noted a barred owl calling at 7:23, well past dawn, which I marked in the notebook because barred owls in this district usually go quiet about an hour after sunrise. Not unusual enough to flag, but worth noting. I reached the cabin at 8:51 a.m. The padlock was secure. The interior was clean. Mice had gotten into the back corner of the supply box but had not breached the sealed food containers. I aired the cabin out, restocked the propane, swept the floor, and checked the wood stove flue. I logged the cabin condition on the paper log inside and on my own notebook. I performed a radio check with dispatch at 9:20 a.m. Reception was poor as expected but functional. Dispatch acknowledged. I gave my planned route for the day, north along the Possum Branch spur to the reported downed tree, then a loop along the ridge above the branch, then back to the cabin by evening. I left the cabin at 9:48 a.m. with day pack, saw, and one radio. The temperature was 52 degrees. There was a steady, light wind from the northwest. The leaves were turning but still mostly on the trees. Visibility along the trail was about 30 yards because of the rhododendron. I want to record one detail from that morning that did not seem important at the time. About a mile in from the cabin, where the trail crosses a small, unnamed seep, I stopped to drink water and to check my map. While I was kneeling at the seep, I heard a single sharp knock, the kind a piece of dry hardwood makes when it strikes another piece of dry hardwood. It came from up the slope to my right, maybe 100 yards out. I waited. Nothing followed. I logged it as wood knock, single, NE slope, 10:31 a.m., likely falling limb. That is a normal entry. I write something similar 3 or 4 times a season. I reached the down tree at 11:14 a.m. It was a red oak about 16 inches at the cut point, lying across the trail at a manageable angle. I cleared it in 2 cuts and rolled the bucked sections off the tread. The work took about 40 minutes. I logged completion at 12:02 p.m. The fire ring was a quarter-mile farther on, exactly where the hiker had reported it. It was old. I would estimate it had not been used in at least 2 weeks. The stones were lichen spotted on the underside, which meant they had been moved into position but had not been disturbed recently. I photographed it, dismantled it, scattered the stones, and noted the location for the maintenance log. Routine. I ate lunch sitting on a flat rock about 30 feet from the dismantled ring at 12:38 p.m. It was during lunch that I noticed the wind had stopped. Not died down, stopped. The rhododendron leaves were still, the high branches were still. The only sound was the seep behind me, and that sound was muted in a way I could not account for. I stood up, walked 10 feet uphill, and listened. The seep sounded normal from there. I walked back to the rock. The seep was muted again. I logged it as localized acoustic shadow near fire ring site, 12:54 p.m., possible terrain effect. That entry is accurate. It is also the first entry in the notebook that I now recognize as the beginning of the week. I continued the loop after lunch. The trail climbs from the fire ring site up to a low ridge and then turns south along the ridge for about 1.5 miles before dropping back to the Possum Branch drainage and rejoining the spur trail. It is not a difficult walk. I have done it a dozen times. I know the landmarks well. There is a leaning yellow birch at the first switchback. There is a broken trail sign about halfway along the ridge that has been broken for at least 8 years and that I have requested a replacement for at least 4 times. There is a small cleared overlook near the south end of the ridge where you can see across the valley to the next ridge over. I reached the leaning yellow birch at 1:31 p.m. I reached the broken sign at 2:08 p.m. Both were as I remembered them. The broken sign still read what it has always read, which is the lower half of the words Possum Branch with an arrow pointing in the wrong direction because the post had rotated on its anchor at some point in the late 20th century. Nothing unusual. I noted both landmarks. Between the broken sign and the overlook, about 15 minutes walk, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I want to describe this precisely because the description matters. The footsteps were not close. They were not loud. They were the sound of boots on wet leaf litter at a distance I would estimate at 60 to 80 yards. They were paced. They matched my own pace closely, but not exactly. When I stopped, they continued for 1.5 to 2 steps and then stopped. When I started, they started. My first interpretation was the obvious one. Another hiker on the trail behind me, out of sight because of the rhododendron and the curve of the ridge. This is not common in this section, but it is not impossible. I called out twice in a normal voice. Forest Service, anyone on the trail? No response. I waited 2 minutes. The footsteps had stopped when I stopped to call. They did not resume during the wait. I started walking again. After about 30 seconds, the footsteps resumed. Same pacing, same distance. I stopped again. They stopped again, after the same 1.5 to 2 steps of delay. I did this 4 times. On the 4th time, I stepped off the trail uphill and waited, crouched, with a clear view of about 40 yards of back trail. I waited 11 minutes. Nothing came around the curve. No hiker, no animal. I logged the time of the wait, 2:34 p.m. to 2:45 p.m., and the result, no contact observed. Then I returned to the trail and continued. The footsteps did not resume that afternoon. I want to be careful here. The footsteps did not resume. The terrain behind me went quiet in the normal way that terrain goes quiet when you walk through it. Birds, squirrels, the small noises of a healthy October forest. I reached the overlook at 3:21 p.m., took a 5-minute rest, and started the descent to the cabin. I have heard things on the trail before. Every ranger has. Sound carries strangely in these mountains. A deer crashing through laurel a quarter-mile away can sound like a person 10 yards away. A woodpecker on a hollow snag can sound like someone tapping a window. I have logged dozens of unidentified sounds over 17 years. I am not a person who is easily impressed by an unusual noise in the woods. I logged the footsteps that night at the cabin as pattern sound, possible following, no visual contact, terrain echo likely. I underlined terrain echo likely. I remember underlining it. I do not remember being entirely convinced when I did. The cabin at night is a quiet place under normal conditions. The Possum Branch drainage is narrow, and the surrounding ridges shelter the cabin from most wind. Sound carries up the drainage from the seep and the small falls about 200 yards downstream. On a still night you can hear the falls clearly from the front porch. On a windy night you cannot hear them at all. The wood stove makes its own noises, the small ticks and settles of expanding metal. The cabin itself creaks the way old log cabins creak. I cooked a basic meal at 6:14 p.m. I performed an evening radio check with dispatch at 6:42 p.m. The check went through, dispatch acknowledged and confirmed weather update, clear overnight, lows around 44, light wind. I noted the update and signed off. At 7:53 p.m. I attempted a second radio check, which I do not normally perform because I had become aware of a steady low static on the radio that had not been present at the evening check. It was not the kind of static you get from atmospheric interference. It was steady. It had a small periodic variation, a slow rise and fall over about 4 seconds. I keyed the radio and asked dispatch for a signal check. Dispatch did not respond. I waited, tried again. Dispatch responded on the 3rd attempt, asked me to repeat, and reported my signal as weak but readable. I asked about the static. Dispatch did not hear the static on their end. I logged this and let it go. The static continued for about an hour. During that hour, I sat at the metal desk and made my notebook entries for the day. I wrote slowly because I wanted to be accurate. At 8:47 p.m., the static stopped abruptly, and within the static, in the second before it stopped, I heard what I would describe as a single syllable of speech. It was not clear. It was not a word I could identify. It had the cadence of a word. It was in the radio static, very faint, and then the static was gone and the radio was clean. I logged the syllable. I described it the way I am describing it now, as single-syllable speech pattern and static prior to clearing. 8:47 p.m., unintelligible. I did not log a source theory. There is nobody else on that frequency in this district at that hour. The nearest other ranger station is 23 miles away and uses a different repeater. I went out on the porch at 9:30 p.m. to look at the sky. It was clear. Stars were sharp. The temperature was 47 degrees. There was no wind at the cabin. The falls were audible. I stood on the porch for about 10 minutes. During that time I saw a light. The light was on the next ridge over, the ridge to the southwest, at an elevation I would estimate at about 4,800 feet. The Burnt Mountain sector has no roads, no structures, and no authorized camping on that ridge. It is part of the Shining Rock Wilderness boundary area. The light was steady, not flickering, not moving. It was a warm color, the color of an incandescent bulb or a propane lantern. It was visible for approximately 90 seconds by my count. Then it went out. I logged the light. I logged the time. I logged the bearing as best I could estimate it. I did not call dispatch about it. There is no protocol that requires calling dispatch about a single observed light at that time of night. I noted that I would investigate the bearing the next day during my second patrol. I went to bed at 10:20 p.m. I slept poorly. I am not a person who sleeps poorly in the cabin. The cabin is a place I associate with rest. That night I lay awake for what I estimate was at least 2 hours, listening to the falls and to the small sounds of the cabin, and to one other sound that I do not want to record in this account but that I will record because the purpose of this account is accuracy. I heard, twice, what sounded like a single footstep on the porch. Both times I got up. Both times I checked. Both times there was nothing on the porch and nothing in the small clearing in front of the cabin. The first time was at 11:52 p.m. The second time was at 1:14 a.m. I logged both. After the second one, I propped a chair under the door handle. I have never done that at the cabin before. It is a habit from my first season as a ranger when I was 24 years old and worked a season in a different district and had a bad week. I have not used the chair trick in 17 years. I used it that night. The morning of October 9 was overcast. Temperature at 6:30 a.m. was 43 degrees. There was a heavy mist in the drainage that did not lift until almost 10. I drank coffee on the porch and watched the mist. I had slept maybe 4 hours. I did the morning radio check at 7:02 a.m. Reception was clean. I gave dispatch my planned route for the day, south along the ridge toward the overlook, then west on the unmarked spur that crosses the saddle into the next drainage, then a circle back along the lower contour to the cabin. I noted I would investigate a possible unauthorized camp on the southwest ridge but did not provide further detail. Dispatch acknowledged. I left the cabin at 7:48 a.m. The walk to the saddle takes about an hour and a half at a comfortable pace. I made it in an hour and 40 minutes because I stopped frequently to listen. The forest was normal until about the halfway point. Birds, squirrels, the distant drumming of a pileated woodpecker, the regular small sounds of a damp morning. At the halfway point, just before the trail begins to climb toward the saddle, the sounds stopped. I want to be precise about this. The sounds did not gradually fade, they stopped. I stopped walking and stood still. I listened. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear my pack straps creak when I shifted my weight. I could not hear birds. I could not hear squirrels. I could not hear the wind in the high canopy, although I could see the high canopy moving. The trees were moving. They were making no sound. This lasted approximately 3 minutes, by my watch. At 9:21 a.m. the sounds returned all at once as if a switch had been thrown. Wind sound, bird sound, leaf rustle, all of it. I logged the silence. I logged the duration. I did not log a theory. I reached the saddle at 9:34 a.m. The unmarked spur that crosses into the next drainage is not a maintained trail. It is a deer path that I and a few other rangers know about and use occasionally for shortcut access to the southwest ridge. It is steep, narrow, and overgrown. I have walked it perhaps a dozen times over the years. I started west on the spur at 9:40 a.m. After about 10 minutes of walking, I stopped because the trail did not look the way I remembered it. The first switchback was in the wrong place. I remember the first switchback being roughly 100 yards in from the saddle, sharp left, around a large dead chestnut snag. The first switchback I encountered on October 9 was perhaps 60 yards in, sharp right, around a much smaller hemlock. I considered the possibility that I was misremembering. I had not walked this spur in about 2 years. Trails change. Snags fall, hemlocks die. Beavers, although not in this drainage, can rework a landscape. Memory of a trail walked only occasionally is not reliable. I continued. The second switchback was where I expected it. The third was where I expected it. The dead chestnut snag was not anywhere along the trail. I do not know what to do with that. The snag was a significant landmark. It was at least 50 feet tall when I last saw it. A 50-foot dead chestnut snag does not disappear in 2 years without leaving evidence. There would be remains on the ground. I did not see remains. I reached the southwest ridge at 11:08 a.m. and walked the contour where I had estimated the previous night's light to have been. I found nothing. No fire ring, no camp, no boot prints in the soft soil, no broken vegetation, nothing. I spent 45 minutes searching a roughly 4-acre area. The ridge was undisturbed. I logged the search. I logged the result. I logged no evidence of human presence. I started the descent at 11:54 a.m. The descent took longer than the ascent should have. I do not know how to account for this. The contour back to the lower trail is a known walk. I have done it before. I have a good sense of distance and elevation, and I have a GPS as a backup which I used twice during the descent to verify my position. The GPS showed me where I expected to be. My body told me I had been walking for too long. I reached the lower trail at 2:46 p.m. By my estimate of the route's length and my normal walking pace, I should have reached the lower trail at approximately 1:20 p.m. There is a discrepancy of an hour and 26 minutes that I cannot explain. I want to record this carefully because I am aware of how it sounds. I did not lose time. I was conscious throughout. I was walking. I was making observations. I checked my GPS at what I believed were regular intervals. The GPS timestamps when I reviewed them at the cabin that evening show the same intervals I remembered. The intervals were just longer than they felt, or the walk was shorter than I remembered, and I lingered. That is also possible. I have considered both interpretations. Neither one feels correct. The afternoon was clear. The mist had lifted. The temperature had risen to 58 degrees. The forest sounded normal. I walked the lower trail back toward the cabin without incident. At one point, around 3:30 p.m., I passed the leaning yellow birch from the previous day. The birch was leaning the other way. I noticed this immediately. I stopped. I walked around the birch. I examined the base. The lean was clearly toward the trail on the previous day. I had walked under it. I had thought about whether it was a hazard. On October 9 at 3:30 p.m., the birch was leaning away from the trail. The root flare was on the trail side. The trunk angled away. There was no scar, no fresh break, no recent root disturbance. The leaf litter at the base was undisturbed. I took a photograph. The photograph is on the memory card from that camera and shows the birch leaning away from the trail. I have looked at it. I have a photograph from a previous patrol, taken in May, of the same birch leaning toward the trail. I have looked at that one too. I do not have a theory for the birch. I have considered the possibility that I am misremembering October 8. I have reviewed my notes from October 8. The notes say leaning yellow birch, first switchback, leans east over trail. East was over the trail on October 8. On October 9, the birch was leaning west, away from the trail. I logged the birch. I did not call dispatch. I reached the cabin at 4:18 p.m. I performed an unscheduled radio check at 4:22 p.m. Reception was clean. Dispatch acknowledged. I did not mention the birch. I did not mention the silence. I did not mention the missing snag. I reported patrol complete. No contacts. No incidents. I want to record why I did not report these things. The reason is simple. There is no protocol for reporting a tree that has changed its lean. There is no incident category for a 3-minute silence. There is no reportable observation in the absence of a snag that may or may not have been there 2 years ago. If I had reported any of these things, dispatch would have asked me a series of standard questions to determine whether I was fit for duty. I was fit for duty. I made the call to continue. I want to be honest. I also did not report these things because I did not want to say them out loud. The evening of October 9 was uneventful in the way that the lack of an event can become its own kind of event. I cooked. I ate. I made notes. I performed the evening radio check at 6:38 p.m. I sat at the desk and wrote for about an hour. The static on the radio did not return. The wood stove made its normal sounds. The cabin made its normal sounds. The drainage outside made its normal sounds. At 8:30 p.m. I went out on the porch and listened. There was no light on the southwest ridge. The sky was overcast. The temperature was 45 degrees. The falls were audible. The wind was light from the north. I stood on the porch for 23 minutes. I did this because I wanted to know whether the porch step from the previous night would repeat. It did not. Nothing happened on the porch. I went back inside at 8:53 p.m. and propped the chair under the door handle again. I slept better that night than the night before. I want to record this for accuracy. I slept reasonably well from about 9:30 p.m. until about 4 a.m. when I woke up because I could hear, very clearly and very close, the sound of my own breathing. The sound was not coming from me. I was holding my breath when I noticed it. The sound continued for approximately 15 seconds while I held my breath, and then it stopped. It was the sound of breathing at the rate I had been breathing while asleep. It was coming from somewhere in the cabin. I could not locate it more precisely than that. The cabin is one room. I lay still for the next 2 hours. I do not know whether I slept again. At 6 a.m. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the desk. I logged the breathing. I logged the time. I logged my decision, which was to complete one more day of patrol, and then break the assignment a day early. There is a standard procedure for breaking an assignment early. It requires a reportable reason. Equipment failure, injury, weather, evidence of a situation requiring additional resources. I did not have a reportable reason. I had decided to manufacture one by reporting possible illness, low-grade fever, request return to base for evaluation. This is not a thing I have done before. It is not a thing I am proud of having done. It is a thing I did. I planned my last patrol day as a short loop, north on the spur for 1 mile, then back. A simple condition check. I would be back at the cabin by lunch, pack the cabin down, and walk out in the afternoon. I logged the plan. I performed the morning radio check at 7:14 a.m. I gave dispatch my modified plan and noted, "Feeling under the weather, may break assignment a day early, will advise." Dispatch asked if I needed assistance. I said no. Dispatch acknowledged. I left the cabin at 7:45 a.m. The morning of October 10 was bright and cold. Temperature at the cabin was 38 degrees. The sky was clear. There was a light frost on the cleared area in front of the cabin. The trail was crisp underfoot. The first mile of the spur was normal. I noted 3 things. A deer track set at 7:52 a.m., a fresh squirrel midden at 8:01 a.m., and a small section of trail tread that had washed slightly since my last walk through. Normal observations, the kind I make every day. At the 1-mile point I stopped, drank water, and turned around to walk back to the cabin. The walk back is where the rest of this account becomes difficult to write. I had walked perhaps a quarter mile back when I heard my own voice. I want to be careful with this description. The voice was at a distance, somewhere on the slope above me to the east. It was speaking. I could not make out the words at first. The voice was mine. I am sure of this. I have heard recordings of my own voice. I have heard my voice on the radio. The voice on the slope was mine. I stopped. I listened. After approximately 30 seconds, I made out a phrase. The phrase was, "No contacts, no incidents." It is a phrase I use on the radio. It is the phrase I had used the previous afternoon when I called dispatch from the cabin. The voice repeated it, not in a loop, with variation. Sometimes the inflection rose at the end, sometimes it fell, sometimes it was hurried, sometimes it was slow. I want to record what I did not do. I did not call out. I did not move toward the voice. I did not radio dispatch. I stood on the trail and listened, and after about 2 minutes the voice stopped, and I started walking again. About 100 yards further on, the voice resumed. The same phrase, same variation, the same distance, the same elevation, the same direction. I had walked 100 yards. The voice should have been 100 yards behind me. It was not. It was beside me, on the slope, at the same relative position it had been before I started walking. I stopped again. The voice stopped again. I waited. I checked my watch. I checked my GPS. I confirmed my position. I confirmed the time. I waited for 10 minutes. The voice did not resume during the wait. I started walking. The voice resumed. I want to record what I felt at this point because the feeling is part of the report. I was not afraid in the way you might expect. I was something else. I was very aware. I was very calm. I was thinking very clearly. I was making decisions about pacing, about where to put my feet, about how much water I had, about how far I was from the cabin. I was doing all of this while listening to my own voice on the slope to my east, saying no contacts, no incidents in a variety of inflections. I walked the next 1.5 miles without stopping. The voice continued for approximately the first 3/4 of that distance. Then it stopped. I do not know exactly when it stopped. I noticed at some point that it was no longer there. I reached the cabin at 10:42 a.m. I packed the cabin in 40 minutes. I have packed the cabin in 20 before. I was slow because I was checking. I checked the wood stove 3 times to confirm it was cold. I checked the propane connection twice. I checked the door latch and the window latches. I checked the logbook to make sure my entries were complete and legible. They were. I also checked them because I wanted to be sure the entries I remembered making were the entries that were there. They were. I did one thing I have never done before. I tore out the page from the cabin logbook with my entries from October 8, 9, and 10, and I replaced it with a fresh page containing only the essential information: dates of stay, brief weather notes, patrol completions, condition of cabin. I removed all references to anomalous observations. The original page is in my personal notebook. I do not know why I did this. I had already decided to file a clean official report. There was no reason to alter the cabin logbook. I altered it anyway. I left the cabin at 11:38 a.m. I locked the door. I performed a final radio check at the cabin and confirmed my departure. Dispatch acknowledged and asked about my health. I said I was fine, just tired, and would be back at the office by mid-afternoon. Dispatch acknowledged. The walkout should take 1 hour and 20 minutes. It is downhill and on a well-graded logging road. I have walked it dozens of times. I can walk it in the dark. The walk out on October 10 took me 3 hours and 11 minutes. I do not have an explanation. I walked at my normal pace. I did not stop except for one brief water break at the halfway point. I did not get lost. The route is a single track with no branches. I did not lose the trail. I did not double back. The GPS shows a continuous track from the cabin to the trailhead. The track is the correct length. The timestamps on the track show 3 hours and 11 minutes. There is a section of the logging road, about a mile in from the trailhead, where the road bends around a small knob and crosses a culvert. I know this section well. I have walked it hundreds of times. On October 10, I walked through this section 3 times. I do not mean I walked through it twice and then once more. I mean I walked through it once, and the experience of walking through it occurred 3 times. I noticed the culvert 3 times. I noticed the bend 3 times. I noticed a particular rotted stump 3 times, in succession with what felt like normal trail between each noticing. I did not stop. I did not turn around. I walked forward. I walked through the section 3 times. Then I was past it. I reached the gate at 2:49 p.m. My truck was where I had parked it. The lock on the gate was as I had left it. I unlocked the gate, walked to the truck, put my pack in the bed, and sat in the driver's seat with the door open for about 10 minutes before I started the engine. During those 10 minutes, the forest behind me was silent in the normal way. Birds, squirrels, wind in the high canopy, normal. I drove out to the paved road and then to the office. I arrived at 4:08 p.m. I checked in. I filed a brief verbal report. I went home. I filed the official written report on October 14. The report contains the standard entries. It does not contain the silence at 9:21 a.m. on October 9. It does not contain the missing chestnut snag. It does not contain the leaning birch. It does not contain the light on the southwest ridge. It does not contain the syllable in the radio static. It does not contain the breathing in the cabin. It does not contain my own voice on the slope. It does not contain the culvert. I have thought a great deal about why I omitted these things. The simplest explanation is that none of them are reportable under any existing category. The Forest Service does not have a form for trail landmark observed to have changed orientation between consecutive days. There is no checkbox for auditory hallucination of own voice on slope to east. If I had included these observations, the report would have been routed to my supervisor and then to a fitness for duty evaluation. I would have been pulled off field assignments pending evaluation. The evaluation would have been thorough and probably correct. I would likely have been cleared eventually and returned to duty. The observations would have entered my personnel file as a documented psychological incident. I have decided I am not willing to do that. I do not know if this is the right decision. I am recording it here because the decision is part of the account. I have not been back to the Burnt Mountain sector since October 10. I have arranged my patrols around it. My supervisor has noticed. He has not pressed me about it. He has worked with me long enough to understand that when a ranger stops volunteering for a particular sector, there is usually a reason, and the reason is usually private. He has not asked. I have not offered. I have spoken to one other ranger about parts of this account. I will not record his name. He has worked the Pisgah district for longer than I have. He listened. He did not contradict me. He did not confirm anything either. At the end of the conversation, he said that he had heard things on the Burnt Mountain sector twice over the years, but that he could not say what he had heard or where exactly he had been when he heard them. He said he had stopped going up there in 2009. He did not elaborate. I want to record a few things I have noticed in myself since October 10. I check my watch more frequently than I used to. I have begun timing routine activities in order to confirm that the time elapsed matches the time I expect. The discrepancies are always within normal range. I keep checking anyway. I have started reading the cabin logs of patrols I did not conduct, going back several years, when I am in the office. I am looking for entries that match my own observations. I have not found any. I have found other things. Entries that are unusually brief. Entries that record routine patrols but that lack the small personal details that rangers usually include. Entries that have been clearly altered. I do not know what to make of these. I sleep with a light on. I have not slept with a light on since I was 9 years old. I have not heard my own voice on a slope again. I have not heard breathing in a room where I was the only person. I have not seen a light on a ridge where there are no roads. The events of October 8 through 10 have not repeated themselves in any setting I have been in since. I do not know what happened in the Burnt Mountain sector during those 3 days. I have considered all of the explanations I would normally consider: sleep deprivation, stress, The cumulative effect of 17 years of solo backcountry work. Carbon monoxide from the wood stove, which I checked with a meter on October 12 and which was reading clean. A localized geological or atmospheric effect that I am not equipped to identify. A psychological event that produced a coherent and internally consistent set of false perceptions over a 3-day period in a person with no history of such events. Any of these could be correct. I have no way to determine which one is correct, or whether the correct explanation is something I have not considered. I notice that I have stopped trying to determine which one is correct. I have one more thing to record and then I am going to put this account away. 2 weeks ago, I was in the office working on end-of-season paperwork. The office was quiet. It was after hours. I was alone in the building. I was at my desk going through cabin logbook pages, including the page I tore out from the burnt mountain cabin on October 10, which I had been keeping in my notebook. I keyed my desk radio out of habit, not transmitting, just turning it on to monitor the channel. The channel was quiet. I sat for a while listening to nothing. At 7:46 p.m. I heard, in the low static of the open channel, a single syllable of speech. It was unintelligible. It had the cadence of a word. It was very faint. It lasted perhaps half a second. Then the static returned to normal. I turned the radio off. I put the cabin logbook page away. I closed my notebook. I sat at the desk for a while longer. I do not know whether the syllable came from the radio or from somewhere else. I do not know whether it was the same syllable I heard at the cabin on October 8. I have considered both questions and I have set both questions aside. I am going to put this account in a sealed envelope in a drawer in my house. I am not going to look at it again unless I need to. If I have not retrieved it within 10 years, I have instructed my brother to destroy it without reading it. I have not told him what is in it. He has agreed. The Burnt Mountain sector is still on the Pisgah District patrol rotation. Another ranger is assigned to it now. I have not asked him about his patrols. I do not intend to ask him. I do not know whether he has anything to tell me. I want the last entry in this account to be the following observation, which I have been carrying since October 10, and which I have not written down until now. On the walk out from the cabin, during the section of road where I walked through the bend 3 times, I noticed something each time I passed the rotted stump. The stump has a hollow on the uphill side, about waist height, that I have looked into idly 100 times over the years. There is nothing in it. It is a hollow in a rotted stump. The first time I passed it on October 10, I looked into it out of habit and saw nothing. The second time I passed it, I looked into it because I was curious whether anything had changed. There was nothing in it. The third time I passed it, I looked into it. I have decided not to record what I saw the third time. I have decided not to record it because I am not certain I saw it, and because the act of writing it down would commit me to a version of the event that I am not prepared to commit to. I have lived with the uncertainty for 3 months. I am going to keep living with it. I am closing this account now.